Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, this little channel only exists because people like you decide quietly it's worth a small gesture. If you subscribe, it simply starts finding its way back to you. No searching required the next time you can't sleep. Our like helps too. It costs nothing and tells me these stories are worth making more of. While you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Somewhere quiet in Ohio, a flat in London, the city gone still, a house outside Toronto, everything settled for the night. Leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, the way they've probably been sitting all day without you noticing. Comfortable? Good. Let's go. There is a particular smell in an English country house at 7 in the morning in the autumn of 1813, and it is not the smell you would guess. It is not lavender and it is not wood smoke, though both of those arrive later. It is vinegar. A servant is moving through the breakfast room with a cloth and a bowl of it, wiping down the window panes because vinegar and water applied while the glass is still cold from the night is what keeps London's soot and country damp from filming over the panes. And a mistress who allows cloudy windows is a mistress who is judged for it, silently, by everyone who visits. Upstairs, in a bedroom with the curtain still drawn, a woman is sitting at a small table in front of a mirror, and she's doing something you would not expect. She's chewing, slowly, deliberately, on nothing at all. Her jaw works in small circles, empty, and if you did not know better, you might think something was wrong with her. Nothing is wrong with her. This is Eleanor Ashworth, mistress of a moderate estate in Hampshire called Thorncombe, and she is exercising her jaw because a slack, unused jawline is considered one of the surest signs of a woman past her prime. And Eleanor is 31, unmarried until 3 years ago, and married since, and entirely unwilling to let her face announce anything about her age before she's ready to announce it herself. I want to stop here for one moment, before we go further, because I think it is worth being honest about who Eleanor is, since I'm not going to make you guess. She's the wife of a gentleman named Charles Ashworth. She has run this household for 3 years. She was raised the daughter of a clergyman with more education than money, and she married into a family with more money than warmth. That is the whole shape of her, laid out plainly. What she does with that shape, over the course of tonight, is a different matter entirely. Downstairs in the kitchen, something even stranger is happening, and it has nothing to do with vanity at all. The cook is measuring out a very particular quantity of arsenic, a pale powder kept in a locked tin on the higher shelf, not to poison anyone, but to mix into a rat paste that will be set along the skirting boards before the house wakes properly. Arsenic sat on kitchen shelves across England as casually as flour did, and no one in this house would think twice about it, though the cook is careful, genuinely careful, the way you're careful with a knife rather than the way you're careful with something you fear. Back upstairs, Eleanor's lady's maid, a young woman named Susan, is doing something to a small ceramic pot of white paste that deserves its own explanation entirely, and we will get to it. But first, 3 miles down the lane, in the village proper, a different kind of morning is unfolding, one that has nothing to do with Thorncombe at all, and everything to do with the strange machinery of politeness that governs every single person in this story, servant and gentry alike. A young curate is walking briskly toward the church, and he is carrying, tucked under one arm, a small stack of cards. Calling cards. He's not making a social call. He's delivering, on behalf of his sister, cards to 3 households she has decided, after careful thought, that she does not wish to continue knowing. This was called cutting an acquaintance, and it required no argument, no confrontation, no unpleasant scene of any kind. You simply stopped leaving your card, or you left one with a corner folded down in a particular way, and the message was received as clearly as if you had shouted it in the street. Regency England ran on signals like this. Entire relationships began and ended through paper, through folded corners, through the precise angle at which a hat was tipped on a public road. I find something almost soothing in that, honestly, now that I think about it. A world where you never had to say the hard thing out loud, where the hard things simply arrived, quietly, as a corner folded down on a small piece of card left on a silver tray in a hallway. There is a kind of mercy in that, even if it is also, in its own way, a little bit cold. Now, back to that ceramic pot of white paste, because I promised, and because it belongs, more than almost anything else I will tell you tonight, to the strange education Eleanor Ashworth received in what a lady's face is supposed to look like. The paste is not quite the deadly ceruse of the century before, the one built from white lead that quietly poisoned generations of fashionable women, without any of them understanding why their skin was growing grey, and their teeth were loosening in their gums. By 1813, most sensible households had moved away from that particular horror, and Eleanor's mother had drilled into her more than once a genuine terror of lead powder. What sits in the pot instead is a gentler mixture, mostly starch and a little zinc, and Susan applies it not to Eleanor's whole face, which would be considered vulgar and paint-like, almost theatrical, but only to the backs of her hands and along her throat, where the sun might have touched her the day before. A lady's face was meant to look as though nothing at all had been done to it. The entire art was concealment of the art. While Susan works, Eleanor is not sitting still. She is reading. Propped against the mirror is a small, worn book, and if you leaned in close enough to read the spine, you would find it is not a novel, not poetry, nothing anyone would raise an eyebrow at. It is a household accounts ledger from the year before, and Eleanor is going back through her own handwriting from 12 months ago, checking it against a private column of figures that exists nowhere else, one she keeps in a locked writing box under the false bottom of a glove drawer. I will tell you what that column is for eventually, not yet. For now, just notice that it exists, and that she checks it every morning before anyone else in the house is fully awake. Let us leave Eleanor's bedroom for a moment and go somewhere entirely different, because this is not a story that wants to sit in one room all night, and there is a scene happening right now, half a mile away, that will strike you as almost absurd. In a drawing room belonging to a neighbouring family, the Pembertons, a young woman named Harriet is practising something with a book, not reading it, balancing it, on top of her head, and she's walking slowly, heel to toe, across the length of the carpet, and if the book slips even slightly, she stops, sets her shoulders again, and starts over. This was not eccentricity. This was posture training, taken with total seriousness by families who could afford a governess who insisted on it, because a woman's carriage, the straightness of her spine, the level set of her shoulders, was read by strangers as a direct report on her character, her breeding, her fitness to be looked at in a ballroom. Some governesses went further still, strapping a metal rod, padded in cloth, along a girl's back and shoulders for an hour or two each day, a device with the almost comically stiff name of a backboard, worn underneath the dress where no visitor would ever see it, so that by the time a girl was old enough to be presented, her spine had been quite literally trained into the fashionable shape. I want to be honest with you. When I first read about the backboard, I laughed, a little uncomfortably because it sounds like something out of a comedy. But then I thought about it longer, and it stopped being funny in quite the same way. These were children mostly, learning before they understood what they were learning, that their bodies were public property subject to correction, long before anyone asked whether they minded. Back at Thorncombe, breakfast has begun, and I want you to picture the table itself for a moment, because it will tell you something. There is no communal pot of tea sitting in the centre for anyone to reach for. Tea, at this point in English history, is still expensive enough that it is kept in a locked wooden caddy, and only Eleanor holds the key. She measures the leaves herself, spoon by spoon, into the pot, in full view of the table, not because she distrusts her own servants exactly, though some mistresses certainly did, but because the ritual of measuring was itself a small daily performance of household authority. The lady of the house controlled the tea. Everyone at the table understood what that meant, even if no one would have said it aloud. Charles Ashworth reads a newspaper at the other end of the table, and here is a small detail that always surprises people. He's not reading it silently, or rather, he's reading most of it silently, but every so often he reads a line aloud, unprompted, to no one in particular, a habit so common among gentlemen of the period that etiquette writers actually addressed it directly. gently scolding husbands for interrupting their wives' breakfast thoughts with unsolicited news from Parliament or the price of corn. Eleanor has long since learned to nod at the right intervals without actually listening, a small private skill that serves her rather well, and which she is, in this exact moment, employing without the faintest flicker crossing her face. There is a sound coming from the hallway now, brisk and rhythmic, footsteps that do not belong to anyone who lives here, and Eleanor's head turns slightly toward the door before the rest of her does, because a stranger's footfall in a quiet country house at 8 in the morning means only one thing: a caller, and an early caller before the socially sanctioned hour, which does not begin until noon at the very earliest, is either a genuine emergency, or it is someone who does not particularly care what people think of their manners, and in a village this size both possibilities are in their own way delicious. It turns out to be nothing so dramatic as an emergency. It is a footman from the Pembertons, breathless from having half run the distance, delivering a note rather than a spoken message, because a note could be reread, weighed, considered in a way that spoken words could not. The note is from Harriet's mother, and it concerns a matter that will strike you, I think, as almost comically formal for something so small. It is a request for permission. Not permission for Harriet to attend anything, and not permission for anything involving Charles. It is a request that Eleanor allow her own name to be listed as a chaperone, on paper, for an evening walk that has not yet happened, and might not happen for another week, because in the delicate mathematics of reputation, a young unmarried woman could not be seen walking even the shortest distance with a group that included any unmarried men, unless a married woman's name was attached to the outing in advance, formally almost like a signature on a contract. Eleanor reads it twice, then sets it beside her plate, and tells the footman, without any particular urgency, that she will send her answer by noon. I find this detail strangely moving, if I am honest. Not the rule itself, which does sound absurd when you say it out loud, a grown woman needing her name borrowed like a kind of insurance policy, so two young people can walk down a lane in daylight. What moves me is that Eleanor takes it seriously. She does not roll her eyes at the footman, she does not make a joke of it to Charles, who has gone back to his newspaper entirely uninterested. She simply understands in her bones that this small piece of paper is part of the architecture holding up every young woman's future in this village, Harriet's included, and that treating it lightly, even once, even privately, would be a kind of carelessness she cannot afford to practice, because carelessness, once practiced, tends to become a habit. Let us go somewhere else again, because I think you will like this next part, and it takes us out of the house entirely and into the garden, where something is happening that has nothing to do with flowers. A gardener, an older man named Bell, who has worked at Thorncombe since before Eleanor arrived, is standing at the edge of the kitchen garden with a small clay pot in each hand, and he is talking. Not to anyone visible, he is talking to the pots, or more precisely to the seedlings inside them, a low steady murmur that has nothing scripted about it. Weather updates mostly, a few complaints about the frost that came early this year. This was not considered strange in the slightest, not superstition exactly, more a kind of working habit passed down through generations of gardeners who believed, without ever needing to prove it, that plants responded to steady human presence the way animals did. Eleanor, watching from an upstairs window while Susan finishes with her hair, finds herself smiling at this every single morning, and has never once told Bell that she can see him. There is a bell now, an actual bell this time, ringing somewhere below, 3 short pulls, and this is the household's private code, understood by every servant in the house without needing translation. 3 pulls means the mistress requires her outdoor things brought up, which means Eleanor intends to walk somewhere before the day gets any warmer, and within minutes a maid is climbing the stairs with a Spencer jacket, a bonnet, and a pair of gloves that have been very deliberately not the same gloves Eleanor wore yesterday, because a lady of any standing was expected to be seen in a rotation of accessories, varied enough that the village would never quite catch her repeating herself 2 days running, even though her actual wardrobe of formal gowns was, by necessity and by cost, a good deal smaller than that rule of variety might suggest. Outside, The air has the particular bite of an English October morning, that specific cold that sits just at the edge of your nose and no further. And Eleanor walks the gravel path along the front of the house with her hands folded in front of her, not because it is comfortable, but because a lady's hands, when not occupied with a task, were meant to rest visibly, folded or clasped, never allowed to simply hang at her sides the way a man's might. Even walking alone, with no one watching but Belle and the seedlings, Eleanor's hands stay folded. Some habits are no longer decisions, they are simply how the body has learnt to exist. She passes the small family burial ground at the edge of the garden, a modest square of iron fencing around 6 stones, and here I want to pause, gently, because there is something worth noticing rather than dwelling on. Eleanor does not stop. She does not linger. She simply nods, the smallest motion, toward one particular stone, a habit so worn into her daily walk that I doubt she is even aware she does it anymore. We are not going to sit with grief tonight. That is not what this hour is for. But I wanted you to see the nod, because it tells you something true about her that the ledger and the gloves and the folded hands do not. Eleanor's walk takes her, eventually, past the low stone wall that marks where Thorncombe's land gives way to the lane proper, and it is here that the morning offers up one more strange little detail before we settle, finally, into the slower rhythm the rest of this story wants to keep. A cart is coming down the lane, driven by a boy of perhaps 14, and stacked in the back of it are dozens of small glass bottles, packed in straw, clinking gently with every rut in the road. This is the leech seller making his rounds between the larger houses, and Eleanor lifts a hand in greeting because Mrs. Pemberton keeps a standing order twice a month, whether anyone in the household is unwell or not. I think it is worth sitting with this one a little longer, because it tells you something about how differently the body itself was understood. Medicine in 1813 still largely operated on a theory that would have been recognizable to a doctor from ancient Rome, the idea that the body contained 4 humours, blood, phlegm, and 2 kinds of bile, and that illness of almost any kind, a headache, a fever, a low mood that would not lift, was a sign that one of these humours had grown too abundant and needed to be drawn off. Bloodletting was not a desperate last measure, it was routine maintenance, something a fashionable family might undergo seasonally, the way you might have your teeth cleaned today, and leeches were considered the gentler, more controllable method, preferred by physicians who treated genteel patients, because a leech, unlike a blade, could be removed the moment enough blood had been taken. Eleanor herself was bled twice the previous spring, for what her physician called a nervous complaint, and she remembers it now, walking past the cart with an oddly neutral feeling, neither fear nor fondness, simply the flat recollection of a Tuesday afternoon that happened to involve a small dish and 8 leeches and a doctor who charged rather a lot of money for the privilege. She does not mention any of this to the boy driving the cart. She simply nods again, the same economical nod she gave the gravestone, and continues on toward the low gate that leads back into her own garden. Let me take you somewhere different now, because there is a whole other current of Eleanor's day running underneath everything I have described so far, and it deserves its own room, its own quiet, twice a week, on days that never quite announce themselves as fixed. Eleanor closes the door of a small room off the back of the house, a room too plain to be called a study, and too private to be called anything else, and she writes, not letters, not household correspondence. She writes stories and small sharp essays about nothing in particular and everything at once, the kind of writing that makes fun of the very rules she follows so faithfully every other hour of the day, and she sends them, folded into larger, blander envelopes addressed to her old governess in Bath, who forwards them onward, unread and unquestioned, to a magazine in London that has been publishing them under the name Mr. A. Fenwick for a little over a year now. I want to say that again more slowly, because I think it deserves the extra breath. The same woman who folds her hands while walking alone in a garden no one is watching, who nods at a gravestone rather than weep at it, who checks a household ledger before anyone else in the house has finished dressing, is also, quietly, under a man's name, earning her own money by writing exactly the kind of clever, faintly rebellious observations that a woman of her class was never, under any circumstance, meant to put her real name to. The locked column of figures in her accounts book, the one I mentioned earlier and told you I would explain, is this. It is Mr. Fenwick's earnings, tracked separately from the household money, growing, slowly, toward a sum she has not yet told anyone about, not even Charles. I do not think Eleanor experiences this as a rebellion, exactly, and I do not want to paint her that way, as though she spends her days seething under the surface. It is quieter than that, and I think more honest than that. It is simply a second self she keeps, the way some people keep a second set of house keys, not out of defiance, but because it is sensible to have a way in that does not depend entirely on someone else opening the door for you. By 10 in the morning, the house has settled into its true rhythm, the one that will carry it, more or less unbroken, until the light begins to fail in the late afternoon, and Eleanor moves into the morning room, a smaller, sunnier space at the front of the house, reserved almost entirely for needlework, correspondence, and a particular kind of conversation that happens between women who have known each other long enough to stop pretending they do not gossip. 2 other women arrive within the hour, both on foot, both entirely within the bounds of propriety, because it is now well past the acceptable calling hour, and I think it is worth pausing on what that phrase actually meant, because the rules governing something as simple as a friendly visit were, by modern standards, almost architectural in their precision. Calls before noon were reserved for family or the most intimate friends only. Calls between noon and roughly 3 were considered ceremonial, brief, formal, the kind where you did not remove your bonnet, because removing your bonnet signaled an intention to stay longer than 15 minutes, and 15 minutes was, in most circles, the outer edge of a polite first visit. Calls after 3, closer to what we might now think of as afternoon, allowed for bonnets to come off, tea to be poured properly rather than merely offered, and conversation to wander wherever it liked. The 2 women who arrive at Thorncombe this particular morning are Mrs. Pemberton, Harriet's mother, and a widow named Mrs. Colby, whose late husband left her a small but respectable independence, which makes her, in the strange arithmetic of village society, both slightly pitied and slightly envied at the same time, since a widow of means answered to no one, a freedom that came at a cost none of the other women in the room would have chosen to pay for it. They remove their bonnets. This, more than anything spoken aloud, tells Eleanor the visit will run long, and she is glad of it, because there is a particular pleasure, one that has not changed in the 200 years since, in 3 women with needlework in their laps and no urgent obligation for the next hour, talking about people who are not present. The talk turns, as it often does, to Miss Featherstone, a young woman 2 villages over, who has apparently been seen walking with a certain Captain Reeve on 3 separate occasions without any chaperone whatsoever, a piece of news that travels through the room with the particular electric hush reserved for genuine scandal. I want to explain why this detail carries so much weight, because to a modern ear it can sound almost nothing at all. A walk, 3 walks, and yet in this world an unchaperoned walk with a man who was not a relation was read as a statement nearly as loud as an engagement announcement, because a woman's reputation, once questioned, could not simply be corrected later with an explanation. It did not work like a debt that could be repaid. It worked more like a stain, and stains, everyone understood, were far easier to prevent than to remove. Mrs. Colby, who as a widow can say things the other 2 cannot quite risk saying themselves, suggests, with a dryness that makes Eleanor's needle pause mid-stitch, that perhaps Miss Featherstone knew precisely what she was doing, and that a woman with no fortune of her own sometimes finds that a slightly damaged reputation, attached to the right man, resolves itself rather more quickly than a spotless one attached to no man at all. There is a brief, sharp silence after this, the kind that acknowledges a truth no one particularly wants to have spoken aloud in a morning room full of tea and embroidery, and then Mrs. Pemberton changes the subject rather too quickly to the question of ribbon, specifically the question of what colour ribbon is being worn in London this season, a topic that might sound trivial until you understand that fashion news travelled through England with almost no reliable speed at all. A woman in Hampshire in 1813 might not know for 6 or 8 weeks what colours and cuts were considered current in the capital, and so calls like this one served as a kind of relay system, each woman passing along whatever scrap of information had reached her, filtered through at least 1 and often 2 intermediary letters, so that by the time a fashion detail reached a village this size, it had already changed twice more in London itself, and no one in the room minded in the slightest, because being slightly behind was simply the accepted condition of living outside the capital, not a failure, just a fact, like weather. Eventually the talk drifts, as it always seems to, back toward the body, because a Regency morning room conversation, for all its talk of ribbon and reputation, spent a surprising amount of its energy on physical maintenance, the small daily labor of keeping a lady's appearance within the narrow, exacting range that counted as acceptable. Mrs. Colby mentions, almost in passing, that she has begun using a new tooth powder, a mixture of powdered chalk and a little myrrh, applied with a stiff brush made of hog bristle, and she recommends it warmly, though she also mentions, with a small laugh, that her last powder, a popular one bought from a London chemist 2 years before, turned out to contain a good deal of ground cuttlefish bone and, troublingly, a fine grit that her own dentist eventually blamed for wearing away the enamel on her front teeth faster than age alone would have managed. This was, I should say, an extremely common problem. Tooth powders and pastes of the era ranged from the genuinely helpful to the quietly destructive, and there was almost no reliable way for an ordinary woman to know which she had bought until the damage had already been done, since nothing on the label, had there even been a label, would have told her. Teeth, in fact, were one of the great open secrets of Regency beauty. A woman's smile, so central to how warmly she was perceived, was also one of the most fragile things she owned, and false teeth, when they were needed, were fashioned from ivory or ceramic, or in the more unsettling cases, from teeth pulled from the mouths of the dead, sold quietly by dentists who did not ask too many questions about where their supply came from. Eleanor still has all of her own teeth, a fact she is quietly, privately proud of, though she would never say so aloud in a room where Mrs. Colby has just confessed her own smile is not entirely original anymore. The conversation turns, too, to hair, and here Eleanor has more to offer than she usually does, since she was, only that morning, subjected to a full 40 minutes of Susan's attention with a set of heated tongs, curling papers, and a paste made largely of beeswax and a little lard, used to hold the elaborate front curls that fashion currently demanded in place through the length of a long day. What none of the three women say aloud, though all of them clearly know it, is that this particular paste, however carefully applied, tends to attract dust from the road and smoke from the fireplace in roughly equal measure, so that a lady's hair by evening often carries a faint grey cast near the crown that no amount of brushing entirely removes, and that the true remedy, universally known and almost universally unspoken, is simply washing it thoroughly no more than once every week or two, since more frequent washing was believed, with real conviction, to weaken the hair and invite catarrh. I want to pause here and say something that struck me while I was researching all of this, because I think it deserves to be said plainly rather than simply implied. Almost every beauty practice I have described to you tonight, the chewing, the tooth powder, the hair paste, the careful arithmetic of which parts of the skin might be shown pale and which must never be shown at all, existed inside a system that gave women extraordinarily little control over the actual outcome. You could follow every rule precisely and still end up with worn enamel or greying hair by 30, or a complexion the summer sun had simply refused to cooperate with. And yet the rules persisted, generation after generation, not because they reliably worked, but because following them, visibly, publicly, was itself the point. It announced effort. It announced that you took your position seriously enough to suffer a little for it. Eleanor understands this instinctively, the way she understands most things about her world, and I do not think she resents it especially, though there is, if you watch closely enough, a very small, very private amusement in the way she sometimes lets Susan's 40 minutes with the curling tongs pass in near total silence, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely, likely in that small back room with the locked writing box, composing a sentence for Mr. Fenwick that none of the women drinking tea in her morning room will ever know she wrote. The women part company a little after noon, and Eleanor is left alone with the rest of her day, which today includes something she rather enjoys more than she is strictly supposed to admit, a visit to 2 of the estate's tenant families, a duty that fell almost universally to the lady of the house rather than her husband, and which carried with it an entire hidden economy of its own. She fills a basket before she leaves, and the contents of that basket tell you, if you know how to read them, exactly how the class system of the English countryside actually functioned day to day, beneath all the talk of rank and title. There is a portion of calf's foot jelly, considered at the time to be almost medicinal in its restorative power, wrapped carefully so it will not spoil on the walk. There is a small twist of tea, the same expensive leaf Eleanor measures so carefully at her own table, given here not as charity exactly, though it functions as charity, but as a kind of soft insurance, a way of binding a tenant family's goodwill to the house that owns their cottage and their livelihood both. There is a little linen, some ointment for a child's cough, and a Bible, worn at the corners, that Eleanor has been asked, more than once, to read aloud from, since not every family on the estate can read fluently themselves, and a lady who could read scripture aloud with warmth and clarity was considered to be performing one of her most essential functions, more essential, in the eyes of many, than anything she might do in a ballroom. The first cottage belongs to a family named Higgs, and the visit itself moves at a pace that would probably frustrate a modern visitor, a slow unspooling of small talk about the weather, about a lamb that did not survive the spring, about a daughter now in service at a house 2 counties away, before any of the actual business of the visit, the jelly, the tea, the small examination of the coughing child, is even mentioned. This slowness is not incidental. It is in its own quiet way a form of respect, a signal that Eleanor has come to sit with them, not merely to deposit charity and leave, though of course everyone in the room understands that she will eventually have to leave, and that the balance of power in the room, however gently everyone pretends otherwise, tilts entirely toward the woman holding the basket. I think what strikes me most, turning this over, is how much genuine care can exist inside a system that is also undeniably deeply unequal, and how neither of those truths cancels the other out. Eleanor likes the Higgs family. She worries honestly about the child's cough, and will send Susan back tomorrow with more of the ointment if it has not improved. And none of that warmth changes this. Her comfort, her basket, her ability to arrive and depart at will, all of it rests on an arrangement that gave the Higgs family very little choice in the matter of who governed the rhythms of their days. The walk back to Thorncombe takes her past the old mill, silent today, the wheel still, and here, for just a moment, Eleanor stops properly, the first true pause of her entire morning, and looks out over the water without any particular purpose at all. This is, I think, the closest she comes, in the whole of this day, to simply existing without a role attached to it. No basket to fill, no ledger to check, no ribbon to discuss, no letter to compose under a borrowed name. Just a woman standing by a mill pond in October, watching the surface of the water do absolutely nothing interesting whatsoever, and finding in that nothing something she does not entirely have a word for. It does not last long. It never does. A church bell, 3 miles off, marks 1 o'clock, and Eleanor's shoulders resume their accustomed set almost before she has consciously decided to move at all, and she walks the rest of the way home at a pace that would look, to anyone watching, exactly like a woman with somewhere important to be. The afternoon passes in the particular quiet way that afternoons in a house like Thorncombe tend to pass. Correspondence, a little more needlework, a short rest that Eleanor would never call a nap, because a lady of her standing did not nap. She merely reclined for a while with her eyes closed, which apparently was an entirely different and more respectable activity. But by 4 in the afternoon, as the light outside begins its slow autumn tilt toward gold, the house shifts gear again, and this time the shift is toward dinner, an event that in a household like this one required a preparation so involved it is almost difficult to describe without it sounding like exaggeration. Susan appears in Eleanor's room a full 2 hours before the meal itself will be served, and what follows is a process with roughly the choreography of a small military operation. First the stays, a lighter, shorter garment than the rigid corsetry of decades earlier, since Regency fashion favoured a high, gathered waistline that required less severe compression than the fashions before or after it, though light is a relative word, and Eleanor still draws a breath in sharply as Susan tightens the laces at her back, adjusting them by feel rather than by any visible marking, the two of them having done this so many hundreds of times together that words are barely necessary anymore. Then the gown itself, a pale sprigged muslin that took the local seamstress the better part of 2 weeks to complete. And here is a detail that I think genuinely surprises people when they hear it for the first time. That gown, delicate as it looks, was almost certainly not washed after every wearing, and in fact might go several outings, carefully aired and brushed between each one before it saw actual water and soap, because muslin, for all its beauty, was notoriously difficult to launder without damaging its shape, its slight sheen, the crispness gathered into its narrow sleeves. The lady's true daily hygiene lived less in her outer garments and more in the layer beneath them, a fine linen shift worn under everything, changed and washed far more frequently than the gown ever was, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping the visible layer clean by proxy. Jewellery comes next, modest by the standards of the grander London houses, a small string of pearls that belonged to Eleanor's mother and a pair of simple drop earrings. And then, last of all, Susan works through Eleanor's hair again, though more lightly this time, simply refreshing the curls set that morning rather than starting over, since a full second styling would have taken longer than the entire dinner itself was scheduled to last. By the time Eleanor descends the stairs, Charles is already waiting in the drawing room, and I want to mention something small here that tells you a great deal about the invisible etiquette running underneath even the most ordinary domestic evening. Charles does not simply offer Eleanor his arm and walk her into dinner the moment she appears. There is a pause, a genuine deliberate pause, of perhaps a full minute, during which absolutely nothing happens except two people standing in a room together, because a husband entering the dining room too eagerly, too immediately upon his wife's arrival, could be read by a sharp enough observer as a small crack in the composed dignity a gentleman was meant to project at all times. The pause is not cold, it is simply the shape good manners took, a kind of ritualized patience that both of them have long since stopped noticing as strange. Dinner itself, when it finally arrives at the table, follows its own precise choreography, one course laid out entirely before the next is brought in, the servants moving with a silence that took years of training to achieve, since a footman whose shoes squeaked on the floorboards, or whose breathing could be heard while he stood behind a chair, was considered to be failing at his post in a way that reflected directly on the household that employed him. There is soup first, a light broth that Eleanor has learned, through years of careful practice, to eat without ever once letting the spoon touch the back of her teeth, a habit so ingrained it no longer requires any conscious thought. Then a remove of fish, then a joint of mutton, and throughout it all, conversation moves along a track so well worn that both Eleanor and Charles could probably navigate it in their sleep. The weather, the state of the roads, a brief mention of the letter from Harriet's mother, which Eleanor has in the end answered with a yes. After dinner, the household observes a custom that always strikes modern listeners as faintly bewildering the first time they hear it described, though it was at the time so ordinary as to be almost invisible. The women withdraw from the dining room entirely, leaving the men behind with their port and their walnuts, and retire to the drawing room alone, where they wait, sometimes for as long as an hour, before the gentlemen rejoin them. Tonight it is only Eleanor and Charles, and so the custom feels a little hollow, a ritual performed for an audience of one, but Eleanor withdraws all the same, because a habit maintained only when convenient stops being a habit at all, and becomes instead simply a preference, and Eleanor has never much cared for the idea of her own good manners being optional. She spends the interval at the pianoforte, not performing exactly, since there is no one present to perform for, but playing quietly to herself, a habit she has kept since girlhood, when music lessons were considered one of the 4 or 5 essential accomplishments a young woman needed to secure a good marriage, alongside drawing, a little French, needlework, and the ability to enter a room gracefully. I find it worth mentioning that accomplishment in this world meant something quite specific and quite limited. A woman was permitted, even encouraged, to become skilled at the pianoforte to a genuinely impressive degree, and Eleanor is in fact rather good, but she was never permitted to become a professional musician, never permitted to perform for money or for strangers, because skill displayed privately, for the pleasure of one's own family and close friends, was elegant, while the exact same skill displayed publicly, for payment, was considered to cross an invisible line into something faintly disreputable, something too close to trade. When Charles rejoins her, smelling faintly of port and pipe smoke, The evening settles into cards, a slow, unhurried game that neither of them takes especially seriously, and it is during this quiet hour, candlelight low and steady around them, that Eleanor allows herself something she rarely permits during the busier parts of the day, a kind of loose, half-present attention that lets her mind wander while her hands keep moving through the motions of the game. She thinks briefly about Mr. Fenwick's next piece, a small satirical sketch about a fictional widow not unlike Mrs. Colby, and she wonders, not for the first time, what Charles would say if he ever learnt the truth of it, and she finds, turning the question over as she has turned it over many times before, that she genuinely does not know the answer, and that not knowing has become, somewhat to her own surprise, easier to live with than she once expected it to be. The evening winds down the way most evenings at Thorncombe do, without any particular event marking its end, simply a gradual quieting, candles allowed to burn lower rather than replaced, until Charles finally sets down his hand of cards and declares, as he does most nights, that he believes he will retire. Before bed, there is one more ritual that belonged, almost without exception, to every respectable household in England regardless of size or wealth, and that is family prayer, a short reading from Scripture led, in most houses, by the master of the house himself, though in households where the master was less inclined toward it, the task often fell quietly to his wife instead. Charles reads tonight, a brief passage he has chosen more or less at random, and the household staff who remain awake at this hour gather at the back of the room to listen, standing rather than sitting, a small but deliberate marker of the household's hierarchy, maintained even in this most private and ostensibly equalizing of moments, prayer offered to the same God on behalf of everyone present, and yet everyone present still arranged, without needing to be told, according to their station. Eleanor listens with her eyes lowered, not from any particular piety in this exact moment, though she is genuinely a woman of faith in her own quiet way, but simply because lowered eyes during family prayer had become, like folded hands on a garden walk, less a decision than a posture her body now assumed on its own. Undressing, at the end of the day, is its own slow unwinding, and it happens almost entirely in reverse of the morning's construction. Susan working the laces at Eleanor's back loose one careful pull at a time, the gown lifted away, the pearls returned to their small velvet-lined box, the pins drawn out of hair that has held its shape, more or less, since 7 that morning. There is a particular kind of relief in this hour that has nothing to do with comfort exactly, or not only comfort, but with the simple fact of being, for a few minutes, entirely unobserved, since even Susan's presence carries a different weight than a room full of neighbours or a husband across a dinner table. A lady's maid saw everything, the real hair beneath the curls, the small marks left by stays laced too long, the tired lines around the eyes that no powder was applied to hide because there was, at this hour, no one left to hide them from. And in exchange for seeing everything, a good lady's maid learned, early and thoroughly, to say nothing of what she saw, a discretion so total it amounted almost to its own kind of vow. Eleanor sits at the little table by candlelight for a few minutes before bed, as she does most nights, and opens briefly the writing box with the false bottom, not to write tonight, simply to look, to run her thumb along the edge of the hidden column of figures, a habit less about the money itself, though the money matters, and more about the simple pleasure of confirming that the second self is still there, still real, still waiting for her under the floor of the ordinary one. She closes it again after only a moment. There is always tomorrow for the actual writing. The candle is snuffed, not blown out, since a puff of breath could send a spark of hot wax skittering across a dressing table, and the room falls into the particular, near total darkness that only existed before electric light found its way into every corner of every house, a darkness thick enough that Eleanor, lying still and listening to Charles's breathing settle beside her, can hear the house itself in a way she never quite can during the day. The small creaks of old wood cooling after the fires are banked, a fox somewhere out past the mill, calling once and then falling silent, the whole slow machinery of Thorncombe easing itself down for the night, the same way it does every night, and the same way it will tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that again. Morning, when it comes, brings washing day, and I want to tell you about washing day specifically, because it is one of those pieces of Regency domestic life that people tend to underestimate entirely, imagining it as a minor chore, rather than what it actually was, which was closer to a full-scale operation that could take the better part of 2 days and required nearly the entire household staff working in some capacity. Laundry, in a house like Thorncombe, was not done weekly for everything. Sheets and undergarments, worn against the skin, were washed more often, but heavier garments, curtains, table linens for special occasions, were done on a rotating schedule that might see certain items washed no more than 4 or 5 times a year. And the process itself, when it did happen, was extraordinary in its physical demand. Water heated over open fires in enormous coppers, lye soap made on the property from wood ash and animal fat, garments beaten and wrung by hand, until the women doing the work, almost always women, had forearms that any modern observer would find genuinely startling in their strength. Eleanor does not participate in the physical labor of washing day, of course, but she is far from absent from it either, moving through the laundry rooms and the drying yard at intervals throughout both days, inspecting, noting which items had come through poorly, deciding which few pieces of fine lace or delicate muslin required the more careful, separate hand-washing that only the most senior laundress was trusted to perform. It is, in its own strange way, one of the more physically present duties of her entire week, the closest she comes to smelling like lye soap and wet wool rather than beeswax and rosewater, and though she would never say this aloud to anyone, not even to Mr. Fenwick's private page, she finds something almost satisfying in it, a reminder that beneath the muslin and the pearls, the house still runs, ultimately on water and fire and the strength of women's arms. A few days later, and I want you to feel this shift the way Eleanor herself feels it, a small lift in the ordinary rhythm of the week, because today is a market day, and Eleanor is going into the nearby town, a modest place called Fenbridge, with Susan and the carriage and a list, written in her own hand, of everything the household requires that cannot be grown, brewed or sown on the estate itself. The carriage ride itself takes the better part of an hour, and here is a small detail that always makes me smile a little when I think about it. Eleanor sits facing forward, which sounds like nothing at all until you learn that the seat facing forward was, by unspoken but universally understood convention, the seat of higher status, reserved for whoever ranked highest among the party, while anyone travelling with her, a companion, a maid, a less senior relation, sat facing backward, watching the road unspool behind them rather than ahead. Susan, sitting opposite, watches Thorncombe recede rather than watching Fenbridge approach, and neither of them thinks anything of it, because this, too, is simply how a carriage works, the same way you might not think twice about which side of the road you drive on. Fenbridge on a market day is loud in a way Thorncombe never is, and I think this loudness is worth lingering on, because it gives you such a different texture from the quiet, controlled interior of Eleanor's usual world. There are stalls selling cheese and eggs and bolts of cloth, a man with a cart of oranges shipped up from the coast, their smell cutting sharp and strange through the more familiar scent of mud and horse and wood smoke that hangs over every English market town. Eleanor moves through it with a specific kind of composure that she does not have to think about at all anymore, acknowledging certain tradespeople with a small nod, certain others with a full pause and a few words, the precise gradient of her attention calibrated, invisibly but exactly, to a scale of social rank that every single person in the market, buyer and seller alike, understands without ever having had it explained to them in so many words. At the draper's shop, she spends nearly 40 minutes selecting fabric for a new pelisse, a warm outer coat suited to the coming winter, and the shopkeeper, a Mrs. Endicott, who has run the shop since her husband's death some years before, produces bolt after bolt of cloth with a kind of theatrical patience that Eleanor finds genuinely admirable, snapping each one open with a practiced flick of the wrist so the fabric falls and catches the light differently than it did folded on the shelf. This, too, was a kind of performance, a shopkeeper's version of the same careful choreography that governed a lady's toilette or a footman's silent service at dinner, and Eleanor, watching Mrs. Endicott work, finds herself thinking, not for the first time, that there is a great deal more skill and labour hidden behind the ordinary transactions of her life than most people, herself included on her busier days, ever pause to notice. While Eleanor deliberates over a deep green wool, Susan is sent to the post office, a small brick building near the centre of town, to collect the household's letters, And here I want to tell you something about the post itself that tends to surprise people because it runs almost exactly backward from how we would expect it to work today. Postage in 1813 was paid not by the sender but by the recipient, calculated by distance travelled and by the number of sheets of paper used, which meant that a long letter from a distant relation could arrive costing the household a genuinely significant sum, sometimes more than a full day's wages for a servant, simply to be allowed to open it. Families developed elaborate, faintly absurd workarounds because of this, crossed writing, where a letter writer, having filled a page in the normal direction, would turn the paper sideways and write a second layer of text directly over the first at a right angle, producing a dense, nearly illegible grid of ink that saved on postage but required the recipient to spend the better part of an hour simply deciphering what had been sent. Eleanor has received letters like this from her old governess more than once and still keeps, tucked in a drawer, a particularly dense example from 3 years ago that took her nearly 2 full evenings to fully untangle, a fact she finds, even now, more charming than frustrating. Back at the draper's, the green wool has been decided upon, and the conversation between Eleanor and Mrs. Endicott turns, as market day conversations often did, toward news travelling up from London, filtered, as always, through several layers of retelling before it reached a town the size of Fenbridge. There is talk of a new style of bonnet, taller in the crown than last season's, and talk, too, of a wedding among a family neither woman knows personally but has heard enough about to have opinions regarding, a young heiress married rather suddenly to a baronet twice her age, a match that Mrs. Endicott describes with a particular delicacy reserved for subjects everyone understands perfectly well without needing to say them outright, as very convenient for everyone concerned. I think this is a good moment to talk properly about courtship itself, since we have circled it several times tonight without ever quite landing on it directly, and it deserves more than a passing mention, because the actual mechanics of how a Regency courtship proceeded, from first acquaintance to eventual marriage, were governed by rules so specific they amounted almost to a formal choreography, one that every young woman of Eleanor's class was trained in from girlhood, the way a dancer is trained in steps, long before she ever expected to need them. A young man could not simply approach a young woman he found interesting at a public gathering. He required a formal introduction, made by a mutual acquaintance who could vouch for his character, and without that introduction, even a polite word exchanged directly could be considered a serious breach of etiquette, an act nearly as significant as touching a woman's hand without permission. Once introduced, conversation at a public event was expected to remain general: weather, music, the quality of the refreshments, nothing that could be read as particular attention, and it was only through a slow accumulation of small, repeated interactions, a dance at one assembly, a conversation at another, a shared table at a third, that a genuine courtship could be understood by the wider circle of watching friends and family to be underway at all. Letters were, if anything, even more tightly regulated than conversation. An unmarried woman corresponding directly with a man who was not a relation was considered deeply improper, verging on scandalous, unless the two were formally engaged, which meant that in the early stages of any courtship, letters had to travel through intermediaries, a sister, a mother, a trusted family friend, each one reading, and in some cases lightly editing, correspondence that today we would consider entirely private. Eleanor remembers her own courtship with Charles this way, 3 years ago now, letters that passed first through her father's hands before ever reaching her own, a process that stripped away almost all spontaneity but replaced it, she has come to think, with something else, a kind of careful deliberateness that suited her own temperament rather better than she expected it to at the time. And then there was the proposal itself, which, contrary to what a great deal of popular fiction likes to suggest, was very rarely a surprise to the woman receiving it. By the time a man felt confident enough to actually ask the question, he had almost always secured, quietly and in advance, the approval of the woman's father or guardian, discussing matters of income, property, and settlement in a conversation that had nothing whatsoever to do with affection and everything to do with practical arithmetic, ensuring that whatever answer the woman herself gave, the financial architecture underneath the marriage was already sound before a single romantic word had been spoken. Eleanor's own proposal, when it finally came, arrived in a garden not unlike the one at Thorncombe on an afternoon she remembers as pleasant rather than thrilling, precisely because she had known, for the better part of 2 weeks by then, from the particular warmth of her father's manner and a certain letter that had passed briefly through his study, exactly what Charles intended to ask her, and exactly what her answer would be. I do not think this made the moment less meaningful to her. If anything, I think it made it steadier, less like a leap, and more like a door she had already decided to walk through, arriving finally at the threshold she had been expecting for some time. The carriage ride home is quieter than the ride out, the way it often is after a morning spent among noise and errands, and Eleanor spends part of it simply watching the hedgerows pass. Susan dozing lightly in the seat across from her, the parcels of green wool and letters and small household purchases stacked neatly between them. It is on this ride home that Eleanor remembers, almost with a small jolt, that there is an evening party at the Pembertons' house in 4 days, a modest gathering, nothing so grand as a proper ball, simply a dozen or so families invited for music and cards, and a cold supper laid out around 10, and she finds herself, somewhat to her own surprise, looking forward to it with more genuine warmth than she usually manages for such things. I want to describe this kind of evening carefully, because it differs in important ways from the grander, more famous assemblies that tend to dominate people's mental picture of Regency social life, the great sweeping ballrooms with dozens of couples turning through a country dance under blazing chandeliers. A private evening party of this smaller kind, held in an ordinary drawing room rather than a rented assembly hall, ran on a gentler, more intimate rhythm. There might be dancing, if the room allowed it, and if someone present could be persuaded to play for long enough, but there was no orchestra, only whoever among the guests was willing to sit at the pianoforte, and the dances themselves, when they happened, were simple enough that a hostess did not need to hire a dancing master to instruct her guests beforehand. Mostly, an evening like this one was built around conversation, music offered informally, a hand or two of cards at a small table in the corner, and the kind of unhurried socializing that let neighbors who had known each other for years simply enjoy one another's company, without the performance pressure of a grander occasion. On the evening itself, Eleanor wears the pale sprigged muslin again, aired and brushed rather than washed since its last outing, and Susan spends a shorter time on her hair than usual, since a private evening among neighbours called for a lighter hand than a formal dinner. When they arrive, the Pembertons' drawing-room is already warm with candlelight and conversation, perhaps 15 people gathered in small clusters, and Eleanor moves through the room the way she moves through every room, greeting, nodding, calibrating her attention along that same invisible gradient of rank and familiarity she has been reading and responding to her entire adult life. Harriet finds her within the first few minutes practically glowing and confides, in a rushed undertone that betrays just how much she has been waiting to say it, that Captain Reeve is expected this evening, and that this will be the 4th occasion the two of them have been in company together, a number Harriet recites with the precise, slightly breathless attention of a girl who has been counting. Eleanor listens with genuine warmth, though she also, quietly, reads the situation with a more practiced eye than Harriet's own, noting the particular way Mrs. Pemberton keeps glancing toward the door, noting that the guest list tonight seems to have been assembled with rather more care regarding which families it includes than a purely social gathering usually requires. She says none of this aloud. She simply asks Harriet whether she has decided what she will wear, a question that occupies the next several minutes very happily indeed. Captain Reeve arrives a little after 8, and I want to tell you about the particular etiquette of that arrival, because it is a small, precise piece of social choreography that would have been utterly invisible to Eleanor and every other guest in the room, simply because it was so deeply second nature to all of them. He is announced, formally, at the door, though everyone present already knows exactly who he is, because a name spoken aloud upon arrival was not truly for the benefit of the guests, but a small courtesy extended to the room itself, a way of marking the moment an evening's guest list became complete. He crosses first to Mrs. Pemberton, his hostess, and only after several minutes of conversation with her does he make his way, by a route that manages to look casual while being nothing of the kind, toward the small cluster of chairs where Harriet is sitting with 2 other young women, and Eleanor watches this slow, deliberate arc across the room, with the quiet, practiced amusement of a woman who has watched exactly this kind of arc, performed by exactly this kind of young man many times before. The music begins not long after, a young woman named Miss Talbot at the pianoforte, playing with more enthusiasm than precision, and two couples form up for a country dance in the cleared centre of the room, the furniture pushed back against the walls, with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggests this particular drawing room has hosted this particular kind of evening many times before. Eleanor does not dance tonight, though she was, in her own younger years, considered rather good at it, and instead settles into a chair near the card table with Mrs. Colby, the two of them watching the room with the shared, comfortable silence of women who no longer need to explain their observations to each other in full sentences. I think it is worth pausing here to say something about what dancing actually meant in this world, beyond simple entertainment, because the physical mechanics of a country dance carried a surprising amount of social weight. A set, once formed, required its dancers to progress down the line, meeting and briefly partnering with nearly every other dancer present before returning to their own partner again, which meant that a single dance offered dozens of small, sanctioned moments of physical contact, a touch of hands, a turn, a few seconds of close proximity between people who might otherwise never have been permitted to stand so near each other at all. This is, I think, part of why dancing carried such romantic weight in the literature and gossip of the period. It was not simply an excuse for flirtation. It was very nearly the only sanctioned form of it, an entire courtship compressed and permitted, briefly, inside the strict repeating pattern of a formal dance. Captain Reeve dances twice with Harriet over the course of the evening, and Eleanor notices, because Eleanor notices everything, that this is precisely one dance more than strict propriety would advise for a couple not yet formally engaged, a small transgression that will almost certainly be discussed tomorrow in morning rooms across the village, though tonight, in the moment, it simply reads as two young people enjoying themselves, rather more than they are perhaps being careful to disguise. Around 10, the cold supper is brought out, laid on a long table in the adjoining room, and here again the food itself tells a story if you know how to read it. There are cold meats, a ham carved thin, a selection of small tarts, a syllabub whipped light and set in tall glasses, and a large bowl of negus, a warm, spiced mixture of wine and water sweetened with sugar and a little nutmeg, considered mild enough to be offered even to the youngest unmarried women present, since undiluted wine at a mixed social gathering would have raised eyebrows in a way a gently spiced, watered-down punch simply did not. Eleanor eats lightly, as she always does at these gatherings, less from any real lack of appetite and more from a lifetime of quiet training that taught her, long before she could have articulated the lesson herself, that a lady eating with visible enthusiasm in company was subtly, almost invisibly, marked down, while a lady who ate sparingly, who left a little on her plate, who declined a second helping even when she wanted one, was read as possessing the kind of delicate self-government that marked true refinement. She thinks briefly of Mr. Fenwick's next essay and wonders whether she might write something about exactly this, the strange arithmetic of appetite and appearance, and decides, turning the thought over while Mrs. Colby chats beside her about nothing in particular, that yes, she probably will. The party breaks up a little before midnight. Carriages called for in careful order according to how far each family has to travel, and the ride home to Thorncombe is quiet and dark, the lanterns on the front of the carriage throwing small, moving circles of light across the hedgerows, and Eleanor, leaning her head back against the seat, feels the particular, pleasant tiredness of an evening that asked something of her but did not, for once, ask too much. Sunday arrives, as it always does, with its own particular texture, quite different from the rest of the week, and I think it deserves its own careful attention, because religious observance in a household like Thorncombe was not simply a matter of belief. It was a fully structured social and moral performance, one that touched nearly every hour of the day and governed behaviour in ways that extended well beyond the church walls themselves. The household rises earlier than usual, and breakfast is a briefer, plainer affair than on other mornings, since a heavy meal before divine service was considered, in a vague but persistent way, faintly inappropriate, a small indulgence of the body on a day meant to be given over to the spirit instead. Eleanor dresses in colours slightly more muted than her weekday choices, not black, not anything approaching mourning, simply a quieter palette, and this, too, was a kind of unspoken rule, understood rather than written down. That Sunday called for restraint in dress, the way it called for restraint in almost everything else. The walk to church takes the better part of 20 minutes, and the entire village seems to be converging on the same narrow lane at the same time, families sorting themselves, almost without needing to think about it, into a loose procession that mirrors, with uncanny precision, the social hierarchy of the parish itself. The Ashworths walk near the front, not quite first, since the elderly Squire Cartwright and his family hold that particular position by long tradition, but close enough that their place in the procession requires no negotiation, no awkward pause at the church door to determine who enters first. Inside, the seating follows the same logic entirely. Pews were not simply chosen. In many parishes, including this one, they were effectively owned, rented on a yearly basis by the wealthier families, with the Ashworths' pew standing empty and reserved every single week whether or not the family chose to attend, while poorer parishioners occupied plain, backless benches at the rear of the church, or in some parishes, a gallery above, separated not by any wall, but by an understanding so complete it required no wall at all. The sermon itself runs long, as sermons of this era generally did, sometimes stretching past an hour, and Eleanor listens with an attention that is genuine, though I will admit her mind wanders more than once toward Mr. Fenwick's unfinished essay and toward the small practical matter of whether the green wool for her new pelisse will be ready from the seamstress by the following week. I do not think this wandering makes her observance any less sincere. I think it simply makes her human, sitting in a cold stone church on a Sunday morning in October, her faith and her ordinary life running alongside each other the way they do for most people, most of the time, without either one cancelling the other out. After the service, there is a slow, unhurried period of conversation in the churchyard itself, neighbours exchanging news, children who have sat still for an hour, finally permitted to move again, and it is here, standing near her family's modest section of the burial ground, that Eleanor encounters something worth mentioning, because it touches, gently, on a custom I do not want to dwell on too heavily tonight, but which shaped an enormous amount of daily life in this period nonetheless. A woman nearby, a Mrs. Yardley, is dressed entirely in a particular shade of grey and lilac, and Eleanor recognises it immediately as half-mourning, the second stage of a formal grieving process that could stretch, for a widow, well over a year, moving through strictly defined phases, from deep black in the earliest months, through progressively lighter shades, before a woman was considered to have properly completed her mourning and could return to ordinary colour. Mrs. Yardley's husband died some 8 months ago, and she still has, by Eleanor's private calculation, perhaps 4 more months of lilac and grey ahead of her before she may wear blue again. It is not a sad conversation between them, not today, simply a small, quiet acknowledgement. 2 women standing in a churchyard in the thin autumn sun, one of them further along a road the other has not yet had to walk, and both of them entirely aware of exactly how far along that road she is, simply by the colour of the dress she is wearing. The weeks that follow bring the season properly into winter, and the whole rhythm of Thorncombe shifts with it, in ways both practical and strange enough to be worth telling you about. Candles, for one thing, become an entirely different kind of currency than they were in the longer days of summer, and the household's consumption of them is tracked with an attentiveness that borders on the ceremonial. Wax candles, the good ones, burn cleanly and without much smell, and are reserved almost entirely for the drawing-room and for any evening when guests are present, while tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, cheaper by a significant margin but smoking faintly, and carrying a smell that Eleanor has never quite managed to stop noticing even after years of living with it, light the servants' hall, the kitchen, the back stairs, anywhere the family itself is unlikely to linger. The difference between wax and tallow was not merely practical. It was, like so much else in this world, a visible marker of status, and a household that could afford to burn wax candles freely in every room at every hour was making a small glowing statement about its own prosperity every single night. Fires, too, take on a new significance as the weather turns, and the lighting of the first fire of the season in each room is treated, in a quiet way, almost as an event, the chimney swept beforehand, the first coals laid with a certain care, because a poorly drawing chimney in a house full of wood panelling and hanging fabric was not a minor inconvenience but a genuine danger, one that every household of this era lived with a low, constant awareness of, checking flues, watching for smoke that curled the wrong way, keeping buckets of sand near the larger fireplaces just in case. Eleanor has, more than once, woken in the night to the smell of smoke and lain rigid in the dark for several long seconds before recognizing it as nothing more than a draught carrying wood smoke from a neighboring chimney, her heart taking a good deal longer to settle than the actual danger, which turned out to be no danger at all, ever warranted. As the days shorten further, the household begins its slow preparation for Christmas, and I think this is worth describing carefully, because a Regency Christmas looked, in several important ways, quite different from the version that later Victorian customs would eventually layer over it in the popular imagination. There is no Christmas tree at Thorncombe, that particular custom still some decades away from becoming common in English homes. Instead, the house is dressed with evergreen, holly and ivy brought in from the hedgerows and woven into garlands by the household's younger servants under Eleanor's loose supervision, a task that fills 2 full afternoons and leaves the lower hall smelling, for weeks afterward, of crushed pine and cold air carried in from outside. The day itself centres less on gift-giving, which remained a relatively modest affair among adults of Eleanor's class, and considerably more on church, on a substantial midday dinner, and on a custom that always makes me smile a little when I picture it, the giving of small Christmas boxes to the servants and tradespeople who had served the household faithfully throughout the year, coins wrapped in paper, distributed the day after Christmas itself, a practice that gave the following day its lasting name, Boxing Day, a phrase that has outlived nearly everything else about the custom that produced it. Eleanor spends part of the season doing something she genuinely enjoys, assembling small parcels for the tenant family she visited back in October, expanding the usual basket of tea and jelly into something a little richer for the occasion, a length of warm flannel for the Higgs family's youngest, a twist of good tobacco for the father, small, careful choices made with real attention to what each family might actually want, rather than what convention simply demanded she provide. And if there is a version of charity that manages to be both dutiful and genuinely warm-hearted at once, I think this comes fairly close to it. In the deep cold of January, a small illness moves through the household, nothing serious, a chest cold that catches first one of the younger housemaids, and then, a few days later, works its way to Eleanor herself. And I want to walk you through how a household like this one responded to something so ordinary, because the remedies applied tell you a great deal about how differently the body was understood at the time. There is no thought of calling the physician for something this minor. Instead, the housekeeper produces a small stone jar of goose grease, warmed slightly by the fire, mixed with a little camphor, and this is rubbed into Eleanor's chest and throat before bed, a treatment that smells, she has always privately thought, considerably worse than the illness itself, though she submits to it without complaint, because complaining about goose grease was, by this point in her life, simply not a battle worth fighting. Alongside the grease comes a hot drink, a mixture of vinegar, honey, and a little hot water, sipped slowly by the fire, and a mustard plaster, a poultice of ground mustard seed mixed into a paste and spread on a cloth, applied to the chest for a short period, producing a warm, reddened patch of skin that was believed, with real conviction, to draw the illness up and out of the body through the surface, a piece of medical theory that had persisted, more or less unchanged, since well before anyone in this house was born. None of it, examined honestly, does very much of anything beyond keeping the patient warm and occupied, but I think there is something worth noticing in the sheer, patient thoroughness of it, the housekeeper moving from grease to drink to plaster, with the calm, unhurried confidence of a woman who has done this exact sequence dozens of times before and watched dozens of chest colds resolve themselves regardless. Evidence, if anyone had thought to examine it critically, that the cold was simply going to pass on its own timeline no matter what was rubbed onto Eleanor's throat in the meantime. She spends 2 days properly in bed, an unusual, almost luxurious interruption in a life normally so thoroughly scheduled, and it is during this brief illness, propped against pillows with a shawl around her shoulders, that Eleanor does something she rarely allows herself, reading purely for pleasure in the middle of the day, a novel borrowed from Mrs. Colby that she has been meaning to start for weeks. I mention this not because it is dramatic, because it is not, but because I think there is something quietly lovely about it, a woman whose every waking hour is normally accounted for finding, in illness of all things, a small accidental permission to simply rest, to read, to let the ordinary machinery of her days idle for 48 hours while her body recovers, and I do not think she minds the cold nearly as much as she is supposed to. By the time she is back on her feet, a letter has arrived that she has been waiting for with more anticipation than she would ever openly admit, forwarded through her old governess in Bath in the usual roundabout way, and when Susan brings it up with the rest of the morning's post, Eleanor waits, with what she hopes looks like ordinary patience, until she is alone in her room before breaking the seal. It is from the magazine in London, and it contains, alongside a brief, business-like note of thanks for Mr. Fenwick's most recent contribution, a bank draft for a sum that makes Eleanor sit down rather suddenly on the edge of her bed, not because it is an enormous amount of money by the standards of the household accounts she manages every week, but because it is entirely, completely her own, earned by her own hand, under her own invented name, owed to no one, accountable to no one, the first sum of real independent money she has ever possessed in her entire adult life. She sits with it for a long moment, the letter in one hand and the draft in the other, and then she rises, crosses to the writing box, works the small hidden catch beneath the false bottom, and adds the figure to the column that only she has ever seen. She does not yet know exactly what the money is for. This is, I think, one of the more honest things I can tell you about her, that the column of figures growing steadily in that locked ledger does not point toward any single dramatic purpose, no secret plan to leave, no scheme she is quietly building toward behind Charles's back. It is simply hers, and for a woman raised, like almost every woman of her class and century, to understand her own comfort as something granted rather than earned, provided by a father, and then transferred, more or less intact, to a husband. The mere fact of the money's origin matters more to her than any particular use she might eventually put it to. She thinks, sometimes, that she might use it for Harriet one day, quietly, if the young woman's prospects ever needed a discreet push in a difficult season. She thinks, other times, that she might simply let it sit, growing, a private proof that exists for no one's benefit but her own. Spring arrives at Thorncombe the way it arrives everywhere in the English countryside, unevenly, a little grudgingly, weeks of false starts before the actual warmth commits to staying, and I want to spend a little time with the garden now, because it becomes, over these months, one of the places where Eleanor's two selves, the composed mistress of the house and the quieter woman who writes under a stranger's name, seem to overlap most naturally. Belle, the gardener, has begun the slow work of turning the beds, and Eleanor spends more time outdoors than she has in months, not idly exactly, since a lady's presence in the garden nearly always carried some ostensible purpose, cutting flowers for the house, inspecting the kitchen garden's progress, discussing with Belle which of the roses survived the winter and which did not, but the purposes feel, to her, increasingly like pleasant formalities layered over something simpler, which is that she genuinely likes being outside, likes the particular quality of early spring light, thin and a little silver, that falls across the beds before the sun has fully cleared the eastern wall. Needlework, too, returns to its usual place in her days as the light lengthens and the mornings grow gentle enough to sit near an open window while she works, and I think it is worth describing, properly, what needlework actually meant in a life like hers, because it is so easy, from the distance of 2 centuries, to imagine it as a purely decorative pastime, a way of filling idle hours. It was that, certainly, but it was also, in its own quiet way, a language, a woman's skill with a needle, the fineness of her stitches, the complexity of the patterns she attempted, was read by other women as a direct, legible sign of her patience, her discipline, her fitness to run a household that would one day depend on exactly those same qualities applied to far larger tasks. Eleanor has tucked away in a drawer a sampler she stitched at the age of 9, alphabet and numbers worked in careful cross-stitch, a small verse about virtue stitched beneath them, and she still, occasionally takes it out and looks at it, struck less by nostalgia than by a kind of quiet recognition, the same discipline that shaped those uneven 9-year-old stitches still visible, decades later, in the folded hands and lowered eyes and carefully measured tea of the woman she has become. There is a whole silent language that ran alongside ordinary Regency conversation, one built almost entirely out of small objects and small gestures. And I think tonight is a good night to tell you properly about the fan, because it deserves more than the passing mention it usually gets. A folding fan, carried by nearly every woman of Eleanor's class to any evening gathering, was not simply a tool for cooling oneself in a crowded room, though it certainly served that purpose too, particularly in a drawing room crowded with candles and bodies and very little ventilation. It was also, among women who had been taught its particular grammar, a genuine method of communication, a fan drawn slowly across the cheek suggesting affection, a fan snapped shut with a certain briskness suggesting the opposite, a fan held to the lips, a small, silent request for silence or discretion. I want to be honest with you about something here, because it is easy for this kind of detail to get exaggerated in the retelling until it sounds like every young woman at every ball was fluent in some elaborate secret code, flirting entirely through hand gestures across a crowded room. The reality was, I think, a little gentler and a little less theatrical than that. Most women knew a handful of the more common signals, learnt informally from mothers or older sisters rather than from any formal manual, and used them the way you might use a raised eyebrow today, a small, supplementary layer of meaning added to conversation that was already happening through entirely ordinary means, rather than a complete alternate language capable of carrying a full flirtation on its own. What was real, and what I find genuinely charming, was the language of flowers, a system of meaning attached to different blooms that a young man might use, with real deliberateness, when selecting what to include in a small posy sent to a woman he was courting. Yellow roses suggested jealousy, and were therefore avoided by any suitor with sense. A sprig of rosemary suggested remembrance, forget-me-nots meant exactly what their name suggests, and a gift of them carried a weight that a young man could not easily walk back if he later changed his mind. Eleanor still has, pressed flat between the pages of a book she rarely opens anymore, a small dried sprig of myrtle that Charles sent her during their own courtship, myrtle carrying the meaning of love, and though the flower itself has long since lost its colour, faded now to a papery grey-brown, she has never quite been able to throw it away. Visiting cards, too, carried their own small vocabulary beyond the simple act of leaving one, a vocabulary Eleanor learned young and has never had cause to forget. A card left in person, handed directly to a servant at the door, meant one thing. A card sent by messenger, without the caller appearing at all, meant something noticeably cooler, a courtesy maintained at a careful distance. A corner turned down in one particular way indicated the call was made on behalf of an entire family, rather than the individual alone. A corner turned down differently indicated congratulations, another indicated condolence. None of this was written down in any single authoritative source that Eleanor ever encountered, no rulebook handed to young women at a certain age, and yet somehow, through years of quiet observation, every woman of her class absorbed it completely, the way a child absorbs the grammar of a language long before anyone ever explains a single rule to her directly. As spring gives way properly to early summer, the household calendar brings with it an event Eleanor has always found herself enjoying more than she perhaps should admit, a picnic arranged by the Cartwrights on the grounds of their larger, older estate, an occasion that gathers most of the same families who might otherwise meet at a formal dinner, but arranges them instead across a wide sloping lawn, blankets and folding chairs set beneath a stand of old oaks, servants moving back and forth from the house carrying baskets, and, in one memorable instance this particular year, an entire cold roasted fowl balanced with visible concentration on a tray. I think outdoor entertaining like this reveals something about Regency social life that indoor gatherings tend to obscure, which is how much of the era's rigid formality was, in fact, contextual rather than absolute, loosening in small specific ways once the setting itself shifted. Conversation at a picnic ran looser than it did in a drawing room. Young people were permitted a slightly wider berth to wander in twos and threes across the open lawn, chaperoned still, but chaperoned from a greater and more forgiving distance, since sunlight and open grass and the presence of 24 other families scattered across the same field offered its own kind of built-in propriety that a closed room did not. Eleanor spends part of the afternoon in genuine conversation with Squire Cartwright's wife, a woman considerably her senior whose company she has come, over the years, to value more than she initially expected to, and part of it simply watching, the particular pleasure of an afternoon with no fixed task attached to it, Harriet and Captain Reeve visible at the far edge of the lawn, walking slowly along the tree line with a gap of perhaps 6 respectable feet between them, that neither of them seems in any particular hurry to close, though Eleanor suspects, watching the set of Harriet's shoulders even from this distance, that the gap will not remain 6 feet for very much longer. There is ice at this picnic, an extravagance that always makes Eleanor think briefly of the strange hidden infrastructure required to produce something so ordinary seeming on a warm June afternoon. The Cartwrights maintain an ice house on their grounds, a deep brick-lined pit sunk into the earth and packed every winter with ice cut from the estate's lake and layered with straw for insulation, a labor-intensive process that could keep ice solid, remarkably, well into the following autumn if the household was careful with it. Few families in the neighborhood could afford to maintain one, and its presence at the Cartwrights' picnic, chipped into small pieces and used to chill a jug of lemonade, was as clear a signal of the family's wealth as any piece of jewelry or any cut of cloth might have been, though delivered, characteristically, with far more subtlety, simply a cold glass handed round on a warm day. No announcement required. The picnic winds down as the light begins to lengthen and turn gold, families gathering their blankets, children collected and made presentable again after an afternoon of freedom, and Eleanor walks back toward the waiting carriages with a loose, easy tiredness in her limbs that she associates, more than almost anything else, with days spent outdoors rather than within the careful architecture of the house, and she finds herself thinking, as the carriage pulls away down the long drive, that she would like very much to write something about exactly this feeling for Mr. Fenwick's next contribution, though she is not yet entirely sure how to put it into words that would not simply read, to an editor in London who has never once set foot on a country estate in June, as a woman describing the weather. Household management itself, the part of Eleanor's life that never truly pauses regardless of season or occasion, deserves a few more minutes of your attention, because the sheer scale of what a mistress like Eleanor was expected to track, quietly, in her own head and in her own ledgers, tends to be underestimated by anyone picturing this world from the outside. Keys, for one thing, were an entire subject unto themselves. Eleanor carries, on a small ring at her waist whenever she moves through the working parts of the house, keys to the tea caddy, to the still room where preserves and cordials and medicinal tinctures are kept, to the linen press, to the wine cellar, though that particular key is more often used by Charles, and to a small strong-box in her own bedroom that holds what little jewellery the family possesses beyond what is worn regularly. The weight of that ring of keys, a small, constant, metallic presence at her hip, is one of the more literal ways a Regency household made visible, at every hour of every day, exactly whose authority the house actually ran on. The linen press alone required a level of inventory keeping that would exhaust most modern households entirely. Sheets, pillowcases, table linens, each piece marked, in Eleanor's own careful stitching, with a small initial or number that let her track precisely how many times a given sheet had been washed, how much longer it might reasonably last before it needed to be cut down for smaller use, turned into cleaning rags, or in the case of the finest, oldest linens, saved for exactly the kind of emergency, a sudden illness, an unexpected guest of considerable importance, that called for the very best the house could offer on short notice. A mistress who lost track of her linen, who could not answer immediately when asked how many good tablecloths remained, was considered, quietly but firmly, to be failing at the single most fundamental task her entire education had prepared her for. Food preservation followed its own elaborate seasonal calendar, one Eleanor has absorbed so thoroughly over the years that she barely thinks of it as knowledge anymore, simply as the natural order of things. Summer brought preserving, fruit put up in sugar, herbs hung to dry along the kitchen rafters in loose, fragrant bundles, vinegar infused with tarragon and other kitchen garden herbs for the months ahead. Autumn brought the slaughter of pigs kept through the summer specifically for this purpose, a process Eleanor herself is not directly involved in but which she oversees at a careful remove, ensuring the resulting hams and bacon are properly salted and hung, since a household that mismanaged its winter meat supply faced consequences considerably more serious than embarrassment. Winter brought the slow, steady consumption of everything the rest of the year had prepared. Root vegetables kept in a cool, dark cellar, apples wrapped individually in paper and stored in shallow trays, each one checked periodically for the telltale soft spot that meant it needed to be used before it spread its decay to its neighbors. I think what strikes me most, laying all of this out, is how much genuine, sustained competence a life like Eleanor's actually required. Competence that history, for a long time, simply declined to notice or record with any real seriousness, filing women like her under the vague, dismissive heading of leisured wives with nothing much to occupy their days, when the truth, examined honestly, looks a great deal more like a woman running a small, complex, year-round operation with no formal training beyond what her mother and a handful of governesses managed to pass along, and remarkably little margin for serious error. News comes, toward the middle of summer, that resolves a thread we have been following since the very first morning of this story, and I want to tell it to you gently, the way it actually arrived at Thorncombe, which is to say quietly, in the form of a note delivered by the same breathless footman who once carried Mrs. Pemberton's request for a chaperone, though this time his breathlessness has nothing to do with formality and everything to do with genuine excitement he can barely keep contained behind his own composed face. Captain Reeve has proposed, Harriet has accepted, and Mrs. Pemberton, in a note whose handwriting is noticeably less steady than her usual careful script, asks whether Eleanor might come at her earliest convenience, because there is, apparently, an enormous amount to discuss regarding settlements, wedding clothes, and the precise, delicate wording of an announcement that must be sent to the appropriate newspapers within the week. Eleanor goes that same afternoon, and the visit that follows is one of the warmest, least guarded conversations we have witnessed her have all year. The careful social calibration she carries into nearly every other room in her life, relaxing, just slightly, in the face of Mrs. Pemberton's open, unguarded happiness. There is talk of a wedding gown, talk of which relations must be invited, and which, for reasons neither woman states aloud, but both understand perfectly, can be quietly overlooked. Talk of a settlement that Captain Reeve's family has offered with what Mrs. Pemberton describes, more than once, as real generosity, a detail that matters enormously in a match like this one, since affection, however genuine, was never considered sufficient on its own to secure a young woman's future. Eleanor finds herself walking home afterward in the long golden light of a summer evening, thinking about her own wedding 7 years before this one, a memory she does not often return to, but which arrives now, unbidden, with a clarity that surprises her, the particular quality of nervousness she felt standing at the front of a church not unlike this one, the way her father's hand had trembled, very slightly, when he placed her hand in Charles's, a trembling she had noticed at the time and never once mentioned to anyone since. She thinks, too, about Harriet, young and bright and utterly certain right now that she knows exactly what her married life will look like, and Eleanor feels, watching this unfold from the particular vantage point of a woman 7 years further along the same road, something that is not quite worry and not quite envy, but sits somewhere close to both, a tenderness for a version of certainty she no longer entirely possesses herself, though she would not, if asked honestly, trade what she has gained in its place. That evening, back in the small room off the rear of the house, Eleanor writes a longer entry than usual for Mr. Fenwick, one that will need, she already knows, a good deal of careful softening before it could ever be sent to London, since what she has actually put down on paper tonight reads less like a satirical essay and more like something closer to a private confession, thoughts about certainty and its slow erosion, about the particular loneliness of being the one who already knows how the story tends to go, watching someone else begin it fresh. She reads it back once, decides it is not, in its current form, meant for anyone but herself, and instead of folding it into the usual envelope bound for Bath, she places it in the writing box alongside the ledger, a private page that will simply exist there, unread by anyone, unless she one day decides otherwise. The year turns again, slowly, the way years do, and autumn returns to Thorncombe with the same particular smell that opened this story: vinegar on cold glass, wood smoke beginning to curl from chimneys that have sat empty since spring. And I want to bring you back, gently, to that same morning rhythm we started with, because there is something worth noticing in how much and how little has actually changed across the months we have spent together. Eleanor still exercises her jaw in front of the mirror some mornings, though she has, over the summer, largely stopped bothering on the days no one is expected to call, a small private relaxation of a rule she once followed without exception. The ledger still sits in its locked box, its hidden column considerably longer now than it was a year ago. 3 further contributions from Mr. Fenwick added to it since that first bank draft arrived, and Eleanor still has not decided, with any real finality, what the money is ultimately for, though she has stopped feeling any particular urgency about deciding. Harriet's wedding is set for the spring, and Eleanor has already been asked and has already agreed to stand up with her, a request that moved her more than she quite expected it to when the letter first arrived. Charles remains, more or less, exactly who he has always been, kind in his own limited, comfortable way, entirely unaware of the second life running quietly beneath his wife's daily rounds of tea measuring and linen counting and calls received at properly sanctioned hours. And I do not think this unawareness is a failure on his part, so much as it is simply the shape their particular marriage has settled into, a shape neither better nor worse than countless others of their era, simply theirs, worked out over years of small daily accommodations neither of them ever needed to discuss aloud. It is evening now, in this final version of the day we are leaving Eleanor in, and the house has settled into its familiar late-hour rhythm. Candles burning low, Charles already gone up, the last of the fires banked for the night. Eleanor sits for a few minutes longer than usual at her small table, the writing box open in front of her, not working tonight, simply sitting with it, the way you might sit with an old friend without needing to fill the silence between you with conversation. Outside, past the garden and the low stone wall, and the lane that leads eventually toward Fenbridge and the wider world beyond it, the English countryside settles into the same deep, particular darkness it has settled into every night for as long as anyone at Thorncombe can remember. Fields and hedgerows, and the distant black shape of the mill, all folding quietly into a night that asks nothing further of anyone, tenant or mistress alike, until the vinegar and the cold water and the first grey light of morning come round again. Before I let you drift the rest of the way, I want to gather up a few more small, strange threads of this world. Things that never quite fit neatly into any single day at Thorncombe, but which sat quietly in the background of every day Eleanor ever lived through, the way certain facts about your own life exist without ever needing to be spoken aloud. Gloves, for instance, governed an entire small etiquette of their own that most people today have never once considered. A lady removed her gloves to eat, always, but was expected to keep them on for nearly everything else, including, in many circles, while dancing, and the specific type of glove, kid leather for evening, cotton or silk for daytime, was read as carefully as any other article of dress. To offer a bare hand to a gentleman in greeting, rather than a gloved one, carried a warmth, even an intimacy, that most women reserved carefully for family alone, which meant that the simple act of a handshake, something we now perform without a second thought dozens of times a week, was, in Eleanor's world, a small negotiated event every single time it occurred. Fainting, too, deserves a moment of honest attention, because it has become, in popular imagination, something of a cartoonish shorthand for Regency femininity, delicate women collapsing dramatically at the slightest provocation. The reality was considerably more physical and considerably less performative than that reputation suggests. Stays, even the lighter Regency version Eleanor wears, restricted breathing to some real degree, particularly in overheated, crowded rooms thick with candle smoke and too many bodies, and a genuine faint, brought on by nothing more theatrical than insufficient air and a warm evening, was common enough that smelling salts, a small vial of ammonia carried by many women specifically for this purpose, were considered as ordinary and accessory as a fan or a handkerchief, tucked into a reticule alongside them without a second thought. Riding, When Eleanor does it, which is not often but not never either, is done entirely side saddle, both legs arranged along one side of the horse, a position that looks, to modern eyes, almost impossibly precarious, and yet was managed by women of her era with a skill built from childhood training, a skilled rider able to jump a modest hedge or manage a nervous horse at speed with no more apparent difficulty than a man riding astride beside her, though the position itself, maintained for any real length of time, left a particular, specific ache along one hip that Eleanor still feels, faintly, the day after any longer ride, a small physical reminder of a rule she has simply learnt to live inside. And sleep itself, the very thing this whole long day has been building toward, looked a little different in Eleanor's world than it does in yours. Many households of this era, Thorncombe included, still kept something of the older habit of 2 sleeps, waking naturally somewhere in the deep middle of the night for perhaps an hour, lying quietly in the dark, sometimes praying, sometimes simply thinking, before drifting back down into a second stretch of rest that carried through until morning. Eleanor has always rather liked this hour, when it comes, the house entirely silent around her, Charles breathing steadily beside her, nothing at all required of her, no ledger, no guest, no letter, simply the dark and her own unhurried thoughts, and the slow, patient wait for sleep to find its way back to her again. There is one more small custom I want to leave you with, because it feels, of everything I have told you tonight, closest to the quiet heart of this whole story, and it concerns something so ordinary that Eleanor herself has probably never once thought to remark on it, though it shaped nearly every waking hour of her life without her ever quite noticing the shape it made. It is the custom of employment, in the fullest sense of that word, the deep, unspoken expectation that a lady of her class was never, under any circumstance, to be seen with idle hands. A woman might sit in a drawing-room for an entire afternoon engaged in nothing more demanding than pleasant conversation, and yet her hands, throughout, were expected to be occupied, needlework, a book, letter paper, anything at all, rather than simply resting empty in her lap. Idleness, visible idleness, carried a faint moral weight in this world that is difficult to fully translate into modern terms, read as a small failure of discipline, a hint of the very indolence that every etiquette manual of the era warned young women against with real, sustained seriousness. And so Eleanor's hands, across the whole of the year we have spent following her, are almost never still, folded while walking, busy with a needle in the morning room, turning the pages of a household ledger before breakfast, or, more privately, holding a pen in a small back room 2 mornings a week, filling page after page with sentences that will travel, disguised, folded, forwarded through Bath, all the way to London, carrying a version of her voice that almost no one in her actual daily life will ever hear. I think that is worth sitting with, just for a moment, before we keep going a little further into her world tonight. A whole life built, in large part, around the careful, constant management of appearances, hands never idle, eyes properly lowered during prayer, colours muted on a Sunday, gloves worn at precisely the correct moments and removed at precisely the correct others, and underneath all of it, running quietly the entire time, a second private current, unseen by nearly everyone who thinks they know her completely, patient, persistent, entirely her own. There is another current running through Thorncombe that I have not yet told you about, and it belongs less to Eleanor herself and more to the small, self-contained world of the servants who keep her household running, a world with its own hierarchy, its own etiquette, its own strange customs that mirrored, in miniature and sometimes in mockery, the rules governing the family upstairs. The household staff below stairs numbers 11 souls in total, and among them exists a ranking system every bit as precise, and in some ways more rigidly enforced, than anything Eleanor navigates in the drawing-room above. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, and the butler, a tall, quiet man named Nash, sit at the very top of this arrangement, and the 2 of them take their meals separately from the rest of the staff, in a small room off the kitchen known simply as the housekeeper's room, a privilege of rank that mirrors, almost exactly, the way Eleanor and Charles dine apart from the servants who wait on them. Below Mrs. Pruitt and Nash come the lady's maid and the valet, Susan among them, then the footman, then the cook, then the housemaids, then the kitchen maids, then the scullery maid, who sits, by long tradition, at the very foot of the servants' table, closest to the door, first to be sent for whatever small errand the meal itself interrupts. I find something worth noticing in how completely this hierarchy governed even the smallest daily interactions below stairs. A housemaid did not address a footman by his given name, not out of any particular formality between them personally, but because doing so would have been considered a small overreach of familiarity that the rest of the staff would have noticed immediately. Meals were taken in a fixed seating order, oldest in service near the top regardless of role, newest arrivals at the bottom regardless of age, a system that meant a 16-year-old kitchen maid who had served the family faithfully for 3 years might sit above a footman of 25 who had only just arrived that spring. Susan occupies a curious in-between position in this world, close enough to Eleanor's daily life to know things about her mistress that no other servant in the house could possibly guess, and yet still undeniably a servant, bound by rules of discretion so total that she would never dream of repeating, even to Mrs. Pruitt, even to her own mother on a rare visit home, the smallest detail of what she witnesses in Eleanor's dressing room each morning. This discretion is not simply good manners. It is quite literally the entire foundation of Susan's employability, since a lady's maid known to gossip about her mistress would find herself unemployed within the week, and unemployed with a character reference too damaged to secure another position anywhere in the county. Susan's own room, tucked under the eaves on the top floor of the house, is small and plain. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looks out over the kitchen garden rather than the more scenic front lawn Eleanor's own bedroom overlooks. And yet I think it would be a mistake to imagine Susan's life as one of pure hardship, because within the particular economy of service, her position is, in fact, a genuinely good one, better paid than a housemaid's, carrying real status among the other servants, and offering her something increasingly rare for a young woman of her background, a measure of financial independence, however modest, built entirely on her own skill rather than inherited from a father or granted by a husband. Susan's evenings, on the rare occasions she has one entirely free, follow their own quiet ritual, one Eleanor has never witnessed and would probably find rather touching if she had. There is a small circle of servants from 3 or 4 neighbouring households, ladies' maids and footmen, and one particularly talkative under-gardener, who meet, perhaps once a month, in the kitchen of whichever house happens to have the loosest housekeeper that season, to share news, trade small treats saved back from their own households' kitchens, and occasionally, when the fiddle belonging to one of the footmen makes an appearance, to dance a little in the flagged kitchen passage, careful and quiet, always alert for the sound of a bell that might summon one of them back to duty without warning. It is at one such gathering, in early autumn, that Susan first hears something that will matter a great deal to Eleanor without either of them quite realizing it yet. A rumour passed along by a footman from a household 2 villages distant concerning a certain gentleman who has recently taken up residence in the district, a widower of considerable fortune named Mr. Aldous Gray, said to be searching with some discretion for a second wife. Susan tucks this piece of information away without much thought, the way servants tucked away dozens of similar scraps every week, useful currency in a world where information travelled below stairs considerably faster and considerably more accurately than it travelled above them. I mention this because I want to tell you something about how gossip actually functioned in this world, since it is easy to imagine it as idle chatter and nothing more, when in fact it served a genuine practical purpose that both upstairs and downstairs relied upon in equal measure, however much each pretended otherwise. A household's servants often knew, well before any formal announcement, which families were in financial difficulty, which marriages were unhappy, which young men had genuine prospects, and which merely appeared to, information gathered through the small, accumulated details of daily service. A tradesman's bill left unpaid a little too long, a letter delivered with visible agitation, a gentleman's valet mentioning, in passing, at one of these very kitchen gatherings, that his master's tailor had not been paid in 3 quarters. This information moved, quietly and reliably, from kitchen to kitchen, from lady's maid to lady's maid, and eventually, in carefully filtered form, upward into the drawing rooms where it would resurface, days or weeks later, as though it had simply occurred to someone over tea. Eleanor herself has never directly asked Susan for information of this kind, considering it, in her more careful moments, a genuine breach of the trust between them, though she is not naive enough to think that some portion of what she knows about the surrounding families has not reached her. Eventually, by exactly this quiet, indirect route, filtered through a chain of conversations she will never see and would never think to ask about directly. Let me tell you something now about a piece of etiquette so precise, so mathematically exact, that it still manages to surprise people even after they have heard about every other strange rule this world enforced. And that is the question of dinner seating, specifically the order in which guests entered a dining room and where, exactly, they were made to sit once they arrived. At any dinner of real formality, and Thorncombe hosts perhaps 4 or 5 such dinners each year, the order in which couples processed from the drawing room into the dining room was determined by a strict, well-understood ranking of precedence, based on title, on the seniority of a husband's position, on a scale of social rank so thoroughly memorized by every hostess in England that Eleanor could, without hesitation, seat a dinner of 14 guests correctly within minutes of the final acceptance arriving by post. A baronet's wife entered before an untitled gentleman's wife, regardless of how much wealthier the untitled gentleman might actually be, and violating this order, seating a guest even one place out of their correct rank, was considered not a minor social slip but a genuine insult, one that guests noticed immediately and remembered for a very long time afterward. Eleanor keeps, in fact, a small private notebook, separate entirely from the household ledger and from Mr. Fenwick's hidden column, devoted purely to precedence, updated whenever a marriage, a death, or a new title in the county shifts the careful mathematics of who outranks whom, because a hostess caught seating her guests incorrectly, even once, was a hostess whose competence would be quietly, permanently, questioned by everyone who had been present to notice. I want to tell you about one particular dinner from the previous winter, because it illustrates this rule rather better than any general description could manage on its own. A newly arrived family, the Wentworths, had taken a house nearby, the husband recently, and rather unexpectedly elevated to a baronetcy through a distant relation's death, and Eleanor, planning her winter dinner that year, had to work out, with real and careful attention, exactly where this sudden change in the Wentworths' rank now placed them relative to families who had, until a few months earlier, considered themselves comfortably senior to them. She got it right in the end, after nearly an hour of quiet consultation with her own precedence notebook, seating the newly minted Lady Wentworth just above Mrs. Cartwright, who had held her own social position, unchallenged, for over 20 years, and who accepted the change with a graciousness that Eleanor suspected, correctly, concealed at least a small measure of private irritation. This same rigid logic extended to the dining table itself once everyone was seated, the host and hostess placed at opposite ends, the most senior female guest seated to the host's right, the most senior male guest to the hostess's right, an arrangement that meant Eleanor's own conversational partners at any given dinner were determined almost entirely by the accident of who else happened to be present that evening, rather than by any consideration of who she might actually enjoy speaking with most. She has sat through entire 3-hour dinners making careful, attentive conversation with elderly gentlemen she finds genuinely tedious, purely because the mathematics of precedence placed them at her right hand, and she has done so every single time, without the smallest visible sign of impatience, because visible impatience, more than almost anything else a hostess could do wrong, was the one failure precedence itself could never forgive. Let me take you into the still room now, a space I have mentioned once or twice already tonight but never properly described, because I think it deserves a fuller visit, being one of the few rooms in the entire house that belongs, almost exclusively, to Eleanor's own particular authority, separate from the kitchen, separate from the housekeeper's usual domain, a small, cool, north-facing room lined with shelves of jars and bottles that Eleanor herself fills, labels and maintains with a care she brings to almost nothing else in her week. The still room is where the household's medicines are made, where fruit is preserved, where cordials and flavoured waters are distilled, and it operates on a body of knowledge passed down almost entirely through women, mother to daughter, mistress to lady's maid, recorded in handwritten recipe books that mixed, without any apparent contradiction, genuine, effective remedies alongside others that modern medicine would recognize as having no real effect at all beyond the comfort of ritual itself. Eleanor's own still room book, inherited from her mother and added to steadily over her years at Thorncombe, contains a recipe for a lavender water that does genuinely help ease a headache through its cooling application to the temples, sitting only 2 pages away from a recipe for a tonic involving powdered coral, believed to strengthen a weak constitution, which almost certainly did nothing of the kind beyond providing the patient with the reassuring sensation of having done something. I want to spend a moment on one particular remedy, because I find it genuinely fascinating, and because it illustrates so well how thoroughly medical folk knowledge and genuine observation could tangle together in this period without anyone involved being able to easily separate the two. For a persistent cough, Eleanor's still room book recommends a syrup made from boiled onions and honey, strained and taken by the spoonful, and this particular remedy, unlike the powdered coral, actually does carry some real, if modest, soothing benefit. The honey coating an irritated throat, certain compounds in the onion carrying mild antimicrobial properties that no one in Eleanor's household could have named or explained, but which generations of careful, repeated observation had nonetheless managed to stumble toward and preserve, entirely by trial and accumulated household memory, without any formal science standing behind it at all. The still room also holds, in a locked cupboard at the far end, a small collection of what Eleanor privately thinks of as the serious medicines, laudanum among them, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol that was at this point in English history sold openly and without any particular restriction, available from any apothecary, and used with a casualness that strikes modern listeners as genuinely alarming for everything from a child's teething pain to an adult's sleeplessness to the ordinary aches of a long day. Eleanor keeps it locked away not from any special fear of it, since fear of laudanum specifically was not yet the common attitude it would later become, but simply because it was valuable, expensive enough that a servant helping themselves to it without permission would represent a real loss to the household, the same logic that locks away the tea and the good wax candles and very little else in this careful, watchful house. The rumour Susan carried home from that kitchen gathering about a certain widower named Mr. Aldous Gray searching quietly for a second wife finds its way, eventually, into Eleanor's own drawing room, though by the time it arrives there it has travelled through at least 3 other households and gathered, along the way, a good deal more specific detail than Susan's original version carried. Mr. Gray, it seems, is somewhere past 50, comfortably wealthy, father to 2 grown sons who no longer require his direct attention, and possessed, according to Mrs. Colby, who has actually met him once at a dinner in a neighbouring county, of perfectly pleasant manners and a face that has aged rather better than most. I mention this thread because it eventually touches Mrs. Colby's own life in a way none of the 3 women in Eleanor's morning room quite anticipated when they first discussed Miss Featherstone and Captain Reeve so many months ago. Mr. Gray, it emerges over the following weeks, has been making discreet inquiries about the widow specifically, a fact that reaches Eleanor first through Susan, then, several days later, through Mrs. Colby herself, arriving at Thorncombe on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with an agitation in her manner that Eleanor has genuinely never witnessed in her before. A widow's remarriage carried its own particular set of considerations, quite different from a young woman's first courtship, and Mrs. Colby lays them out for Eleanor with the frank, unguarded honesty of a woman past the age of needing to pretend otherwise. Remarriage would mean surrendering the independence her widowhood currently affords her, the modest fortune that is at present entirely her own to manage as she sees fit, becoming instead, upon marriage, legally and financially subsumed into her husband's control, a transfer so total that a married woman of this era possessed almost no independent legal existence at all, unable to own property in her own name, unable to sign a contract, unable in the most literal sense to control the very money that had been hers alone only the day before her wedding. Eleanor listens to all of this with a particular, quiet attentiveness, because it touches, more directly than almost anything else in this whole long year, on the private column of figures still growing steadily in her own locked ledger, and she finds herself, for the first time, genuinely grateful that her own small independence has never had to survive the legal transformation Mrs. Colby is now weighing so carefully. Mr. Fenwick's earnings, she realizes, sitting with Mrs. Colby's dilemma turning over in her mind, exist in a strange, quiet space entirely outside the normal architecture of a married woman's finances, unknown to Charles, unclaimed by any law that would otherwise absorb them instantly into his name the moment he learnt of their existence. A private fact she has never quite examined this directly before, and one that leaves her, once Mrs. Colby has gone, sitting rather longer than usual at her small writing table that evening. Mrs. Colby, in the end, declines Mr. Gray's eventual, carefully worded proposal, choosing, as she tells Eleanor with a dry, characteristic humour some weeks later, her own modest independence over what she describes as a perfectly pleasant offer of considerably reduced freedom, and Eleanor finds herself admiring this decision more than she quite expects to, filing it away quietly alongside so many other small observations of what a woman's life might look like, arranged just slightly differently than her own. Let me tell you now about a journey, a genuine departure from Thorncombe, because in the early part of the following spring, Eleanor and Charles travel to Bath for a little over 2 weeks, a visit made partly for pleasure and partly at the quiet, persistent suggestion of Eleanor's own mother, who believes, with real conviction, that the waters there might ease a stiffness that has begun troubling Charles's left shoulder since the previous autumn. Bath, when they arrive, presents an entirely different texture of life than anything Thorncombe or Fenbridge could offer, a city built almost entirely around the business of leisure, its golden stone crescents and terraces filled, at every hour of the day, with visitors moving between the pump room, the assembly rooms, and the many shops lining Milsom Street, a density of fashionable society that Eleanor finds, after the quiet predictability of her usual world, both exhilarating and, by the second week, rather more exhausting than she expected. The taking of the waters itself follows its own precise ritual, one Eleanor observes with the same careful, curious attention she brings to nearly everything. Visitors gather each morning in the pump room, an elegant hall built specifically for the purpose, where a pump brings the warm, mineral-rich water directly from the spring below, and a designated pumper fills glass after glass for a steady queue of visitors, the water itself carrying a distinct, faintly sulphurous taste that Eleanor finds genuinely unpleasant on her first attempt, and only marginally more tolerable by her fifth. Charles drinks his glass dutifully each morning, his physician back in Hampshire having recommended the regimen with real seriousness, and whether the water itself does anything at all for his shoulder remains, by the end of their stay, a matter of some private doubt on Eleanor's part, though the stiffness does in fact ease somewhat over the course of their visit, a fact she privately attributes rather more to the enforced rest and gentle daily walking than to any particular mineral property of the water itself. The pump room serves a second, equally important function beyond its medicinal water, functioning as one of the great social exchanges of the entire city, a place where news, introductions, and careful social manoeuvring happened continuously throughout the morning hours, and it is here, on their 4th morning in the city, that Eleanor encounters someone she has not seen in nearly a decade, an old-school friend named Charlotte, now married to a naval officer and settled, she explains over a shared glass of the mineral water neither of them particularly enjoys, in Portsmouth. The two women fall into conversation with the easy, immediate warmth of old friendship, and Eleanor finds herself telling Charlotte things she has not said aloud to anyone in years, small, honest observations about the particular loneliness of a well-run household, about the strange, constant labour of appearing content that she has never quite named so directly even in her own private thoughts. She does not tell Charlotte about Mr. Fenwick. That secret remains exactly where it has always lived, locked, private, entirely her own. But something about the anonymity of a strange city and the safety of a friendship untethered from the daily social machinery of Hampshire loosens Eleanor's tongue in a way that surprises her, and she leaves the pump room that morning feeling lighter than she has felt in some months, a lightness she carries with her, quietly, for the remainder of their stay in Bath. Shopping on Milsom Street occupies a good portion of Eleanor's remaining mornings in Bath, and I want to tell you about it properly, because the experience differs, in ways both large and small, from the more familiar rhythm of Mrs. Endicott's shop back in Fenbridge. The shops here are grander, their windows dressed with a theatrical care that a country draper would never think to attempt, bolts of silk and fine muslin displayed against dark backgrounds, specifically chosen to make the fabric catch the light most flatteringly, and Eleanor finds herself, more than once, genuinely tempted by fabrics considerably finer and considerably more expensive than anything she would normally purchase for herself. She allows herself one true extravagance during their stay, a length of pale blue silk, shot through with a faint, shifting shimmer that the shopkeeper demonstrates by turning the bolt slowly beneath the window's light, and Eleanor watches the colour seem to change, blue to something almost silver and back again, with a fascination she does not entirely bother concealing. Charles, standing nearby with the particular patient boredom of a husband accompanying his wife through an extended shopping expedition, notices her fascination and, in a small act of generosity that catches her slightly off guard, insists on purchasing the full length himself, a gesture that reminds Eleanor, not for the first time, that whatever else their marriage lacks in the particular romantic intensity she sometimes reads about in borrowed novels, it is not lacking in genuine, steady kindness. One evening during their stay, they attend the assembly rooms, a grand, elegant space considerably larger and more formally organized than anything Eleanor experiences at home. Hundreds of visitors moving through rooms designed specifically for exactly this purpose. Cards, tea, conversation, and dancing, all held within a single magnificent building that exists in its entirety for the business of fashionable socializing. Eleanor dances twice that evening, once with Charles and once, following the careful formal introduction required by etiquette, with a pleasant, rather shy young officer on leave from his regiment, and she finds, moving through the familiar steps of a dance she has not performed in some time, a physical pleasure in it that surprises her, her body remembering patterns her mind had half forgotten it ever knew. Their 2 weeks pass more quickly than either of them expects, and the journey home, when it finally comes, carries with it the particular, mixed feeling of a good holiday drawing to its close, genuine gladness at the thought of returning to familiar rooms and familiar faces, mixed with a small, private wistfulness Eleanor does not entirely examine too closely, a sense that some version of herself, looser and more talkative than the one who manages Thorncombe's linen press and tea caddy, has been left behind somewhere in that golden stone city, available to her again, perhaps, on some future visit, but not, for now, part of the daily shape of her life. Back at Thorncombe, spring settles properly into place, and with it comes the event that has been quietly anchoring the entire back half of this story, Harriet's wedding, now only a matter of weeks away. And I want to tell you about the preparations properly, because a Regency wedding, examined closely, looked rather different from the elaborate months-long production a modern wedding has become, smaller in scale, quicker in its arrangements, but no less carefully governed by its own particular customs. Harriet's trousseau, the collection of clothing and household linen a bride brought with her into marriage, has been assembling for months by the time Eleanor calls to see it properly displayed across the beds in the Pembertons' best guest room, and it represents, laid out like this, a genuinely significant investment on the part of Harriet's family. Dozens of shifts and stockings, several new gowns, an abundance of fine linen marked with Harriet's new initials rather than her old ones, a small but real fortune sewn, quite literally, into the fabric of her new life. Eleanor examines it all with real attention, offering the kind of practical, experienced advice a woman 3 years into her own marriage is well positioned to give, noting which fabrics will wear best, which items Harriet will likely wish she had purchased more of once the first year of housekeeping reveals its actual demands. The wedding gown itself is not white, a detail that tends to surprise people who assume white wedding dresses have always been the standard, when in fact the custom would not become truly widespread for several more decades yet, following a much later royal wedding that has not happened yet in Eleanor's world, and will not happen for some years to come. Harriet's gown instead is a pale, soft cream silk, chosen because it flatters her colouring, and because cream, unlike a truly practical colour, could plausibly be worn again afterward for a formal evening occasion, since even a bride's family, however comfortable, generally preferred a gown with some further use ahead of it, rather than one destined to be worn exactly once and then folded away forever. The wedding itself takes place on a bright morning in May, in the same small parish church where Eleanor has sat in her rented family pew every Sunday for the past 3 years, and the ceremony proceeds with a brevity that might surprise a modern observer accustomed to lengthy modern services, the actual exchange of vows taking no more than perhaps 20 minutes from beginning to end, followed immediately by a wedding breakfast back at the Pembertons' house, a substantial midday meal rather than the evening celebration a modern wedding typically favours, since the timing of the service itself, required by law to take place before noon at this point in English history, shaped the entire remaining schedule of the celebration that followed it. Eleanor stands with Harriet throughout the ceremony exactly as promised, and watches with an emotion considerably more complicated than simple happiness, though happiness is certainly present in it too, as the young woman she has known since childhood becomes, in the space of 20 brief minutes, a wife, her legal identity, her property, her very name absorbed into her new husband's in a transformation so total and so instant that Eleanor, watching it happen, finds her mind drifting, almost against her will, back to her own wedding morning 7 years before, and to the particular, specific weight of her own father's trembling hand. The wedding breakfast itself carries its own small collection of customs worth pausing on, because several of them have survived, in altered form, all the way into the present day, though their original meaning has mostly been forgotten along the way. There is a bride cake, rich and dense with fruit, far heavier and darker than a modern wedding cake, and a portion of it, following custom, is not eaten at all but wrapped carefully and set aside, to be passed later beneath the pillow of any unmarried woman present who wishes, that night, to dream of her own future husband, a small piece of folk magic that every unmarried guest at Harriet's wedding participates in with a mixture of genuine hope and self-aware amusement, Eleanor herself remembering, with real fondness, doing exactly the same thing at her own sister's wedding many years before, though she recalls now, a little ruefully, that whatever she dreamed that particular night, she has long since entirely forgotten. Toasts follow the meal, formal and carefully structured, the bride's health proposed first, then the groom's, then a toast to the bride's parents, each one met with the raised glasses and murmured approval of the assembled guests, and Eleanor notices, watching Mrs. Pemberton's face throughout this sequence, the particular mixture of pride and quiet grief that seems to sit behind so many mothers' expressions at their daughters' weddings, a happiness genuinely felt alongside something that looks, unmistakably, like the beginning of a loss that has not quite finished arriving yet. Captain Reeve and Harriet depart that same afternoon for a short bridal tour, a modest version of what a wealthier couple might extend into weeks or even months of travel. Theirs limited to a little over a week spent visiting a cousin of the captain's near the coast, and I think it is worth mentioning that the honeymoon, as a genuinely private, romantic retreat for just the couple themselves, is not quite yet the custom it will later become. Bridal tours of this era often included visiting relations along the way, a practical combination of travel and family obligation that would strike a modern newlywed couple as rather odd, though Harriet, when Eleanor asks her privately before the couple departs, seems entirely delighted by the prospect regardless, glowing with the particular, uncomplicated happiness of a young woman who has gotten exactly what she wanted and has not yet had time to discover what marriage will actually ask of her in exchange. Eleanor watches the carriage pull away down the Pembertons' long drive, Harriet's hand visible for a moment through the window, waving until the carriage turns the corner and disappears behind the hedgerow, and she feels, standing there in the thin afternoon sun, a complicated tenderness she does not fully examine, equal parts genuine happiness for her young friend, and a quiet, private awareness, entirely her own, of exactly how much of what lies ahead Harriet cannot yet see, the long stretch of ordinary days that will eventually settle in behind the wedding's brief, bright morning, the small accommodations, the private disappointments, the particular skill, learned slowly and mostly alone, of building a second self quiet enough to survive inside a life that asks so much of its visible surface. Summer arrives properly in the weeks that follow, and with it comes a custom particular to the countryside itself, rather than to any single family's calendar: harvest home, a celebration marking the final gathering in of the wheat, and I want to tell you about it because it offers such a different texture from nearly everything else we have witnessed together tonight. A rare occasion when the usual careful boundaries of rank loosen just slightly in the shared, practical relief of a harvest safely brought in before the weather could ruin it. The last cart of wheat, decorated with ribbons and a wreath of corn ears woven by the harvesters themselves, is drawn in from the fields to general cheering, and the celebration that follows takes place by long tradition, with the whole estate present together, tenants, labourers, household servants, and the Ashworths themselves, gathered around long tables set up in the largest barn, lit by lanterns as the summer evening finally begins to cool. The food is simple and abundant, a whole roasted joint, bread still warm from the oven, and ale brewed specifically for the occasion, stronger and sweeter than the household's everyday small beer, and Eleanor, moving through the gathering with Charles at her side, finds the entire evening carries a warmth that none of her more formal social occasions quite manage to replicate. She does not forget her position tonight, not entirely, since even Harvest Home maintains its own quiet gradations. The Ashworths seated at the head of the longest table, served first, addressed with the same careful deference that governs every other day of the year, but there is, undeniably, a loosening here that Eleanor genuinely values. Labourers she rarely speaks with directly the rest of the year approaching her table to offer a toast, a fiddle striking up as the evening deepens, and the barn floor clearing for dancing that follows none of the careful, formal steps of an assembly room, simply the loose, joyful movement of people who have worked hard together and are glad, for one evening, to celebrate together too. Eleanor dances twice that night, once with Charles and once, to her own quiet surprise, with Belle the gardener, who asks her with a shy formality that makes her smile, and she accepts without a second thought, moving through a simple country reel, with a man whose hands, rough with decades of soil and pruning shears, feel entirely different in hers than any hand she has held at a formal ball, and she thinks, turning through the dance in the lantern light, that there is a particular, specific pleasure in this kind of evening that all her more elegant occasions somehow never quite manage to offer her in quite the same measure, something closer to simple, uncomplicated belonging, briefly, gratefully, shared. Eleanor's own father visits Thorncombe in late summer, travelling up from the small parish in Dorset, where he has served as clergyman for over 30 years now, and I want to spend a little time with this visit, because it offers a rare, direct window into the particular kind of upbringing that shaped Eleanor into the woman she has become, an upbringing built, as I mentioned very near the beginning of tonight's story, on considerably more education than money. Reverend Whitfield, as he is known throughout his own small parish, arrives with a single modest trunk and an even more modest expectation of comfort, having spent his entire clerical career in a household of careful, genteel economy, quite different from the more comfortable circumstances Eleanor now enjoys as Charles's wife. He is a man of real learning, fluent in Latin and passable Greek, and it was he, not any hired governess, who taught Eleanor to read at an age when most girls of her class were still working through their letters under considerably less rigorous instruction, a fact that shaped in ways Eleanor herself only half recognizes the particular sharpness of observation that eventually found its way into Mr. Fenwick's essays. Over the course of his visit, father and daughter fall into long conversations that range considerably further than the usual polite topics of Eleanor's ordinary social calls, touching on books, on scripture, on the wider political news, reaching even a small Dorset parish through the newspapers Reverend Whitfield reads with real attention despite the modest circumstances of his own household. Eleanor finds herself in these conversations closer to the sharp, curious girl she was before her marriage than she typically allows herself to be in any other context, and she catches herself, more than once, nearly mentioning Mr. Fenwick directly, the words rising unbidden before she catches them, and redirects the conversation elsewhere, not from any real fear that her father would judge her harshly, since she suspects privately that he might actually understand better than almost anyone else in her life, but simply because the secret has lived, for so long now, in such careful isolation that she finds she is not quite ready to let even one more person into it. Not yet, perhaps not ever. He asks after her happiness directly, on the second evening of his visit, in the plain, unadorned way that has always characterized his conversation with her, and Eleanor answers honestly, or as honestly as she is able, telling him that she is content, that Charles is kind, that the household runs well, all of which is entirely true, and none of which quite touches the fuller, more complicated truth she carries privately in her locked writing box. Reverend Whitfield studies her for a long moment after she finishes, the particular searching look she remembers from childhood, the one that always seemed to see rather further into her than she strictly wanted him to, and then he simply nods, once, and changes the subject to a question about the state of Thorncombe's kitchen garden, and Eleanor understands, without either of them saying so directly, that he has heard the things she did not say every bit as clearly as the things she did. His visit brings to mind for Eleanor the whole shape of her own girlhood education, and I think it is worth telling you properly about what that education actually looked like for a young woman of her class. Because the popular idea of Regency female education, all watercolour painting and polite French phrases, tends to flatten a system that was in practice considerably more varied and considerably more demanding than its reputation suggests, at least for a girl fortunate enough to have a father who took the matter seriously. Eleanor's earliest lessons came directly from her father, as I have already mentioned, reading and basic arithmetic, taught with the same rigour he might have applied to a promising young curate, and it was only somewhat later, once these foundations were solidly established, that the more conventional accomplishments began. French with a visiting tutor twice weekly, drawing and watercolour instruction from an itinerant drawing master who travelled a circuit of several parishes, music lessons on a borrowed pianoforte, until her father, through careful economy over several years, managed to purchase a modest instrument of their own. The purpose of all this instruction, stated plainly and without much euphemism by nearly every conduct manual and etiquette guide of the period, was ultimately matrimonial, a young woman's accomplishments existing primarily to make her a more attractive prospect for marriage, her drawing and music and passable French serving as a kind of visible proof of the patience, discipline and refinement she would eventually bring to running a household of her own. And yet I think it would be a mistake to imagine that this instrumental purpose entirely drained the education itself of genuine value or genuine pleasure, because Eleanor's own relationship to her lessons, particularly to reading and to her father's more rigorous instruction, always carried something considerably more personal than simple preparation for the marriage market, a genuine hunger for ideas that her father, to his considerable credit, never once tried to discourage or redirect toward more conventionally feminine pursuits. What her education did not include, and what nearly no young woman of her class received, regardless of how intellectually curious her family might be, was any formal instruction in the kind of writing Eleanor now practices twice a week in her small back room: satire, social observation, the particular sharp, structured argument that Mr. Fenwick's essays require. This she taught herself, slowly, over years of careful private reading, studying the essays and periodicals her father received and discussed with her, absorbing their structure and their rhythm, the way a musician absorbs a piece of music through repeated listening, long before she ever attempts to play a note of it herself. And I think there is something worth admiring in this particular kind of self-education, unsupported by any tutor, unrecognized by any formal system, built entirely from her own patient attention and her own quiet determination to understand how a certain kind of sentence achieved its particular, precise effect. There is one more small piece of the postal system I want to tell you about before we move toward the close of this story, because it connects in a way I find quietly satisfying, back to something we touched on during that market day trip to Fenbridge many months ago. Members of Parliament and certain other high-ranking officials possessed something called franking privilege, the ability to sign their own name across the front of an envelope and have it carried through the entire postal system entirely free of charge, a privilege originally intended for official government correspondence, but which, in practice, extended rather generously to personal letters as well, provided a friendly member of Parliament could be persuaded to add his signature. Charles's own cousin sits in Parliament for a small borough in the West Country, and Eleanor has, on perhaps a dozen occasions over the years, sent letters to her old governess in Bath, tucked inside an outer envelope, addressed to this cousin, who forwards them onward with his frank applied, saving the household a meaningful sum over the course of a year. and I want you to notice something rather delightful hiding inside this small practical arrangement, which is that the very same postal channel Eleanor uses to smuggle Mr. Fenwick's essays toward London, disguised as ordinary correspondence to her governess, occasionally rides along, entirely by coincidence, on the franking privilege of a member of Parliament who has not the faintest idea that his signature is helping carry a woman's secret literary career across 2 counties at no charge whatsoever. Weather, too, carried its own body of accumulated folk knowledge at Thorncombe, most of it filtered through Bell the gardener, whose forecasts, delivered each morning with a confidence that decades of careful observation had genuinely earned him, prove, more often than not, considerably more reliable than anything the household could have learnt from a newspaper, even if a reliable weather report had existed to print, which it largely did not. Bell reads the sky, the behaviour of the estate's rooks, wheeling and calling with a particular urgency he claims always precedes a storm, the smell of the air itself, which he insists, and which Eleanor has come, over years of observation, to half believe herself, carries a distinct and recognizable change in the hours before rain arrives, something sharper, mineral, that she has never quite managed to describe to her own satisfaction, but which she has, on more than one occasion, smelled herself and reached for a shawl accordingly, moments before the first drops actually began to fall. I find something worth treasuring in this kind of knowledge, accumulated not through any book or formal system, but through decades of one man's careful, patient attention to a single small patch of English countryside, knowledge that will very likely die with Bell himself, or with whoever eventually apprentices under him, long enough to absorb it properly, since almost none of it exists written down anywhere at all, living instead entirely in the accumulated embodied memory of people who spent their whole lives watching one particular sky. As the days shorten once more, autumn settling back over Thorncombe for the second time since we first arrived here together, I want to tell you about one final evening custom before we let the whole year and this whole long story finally come to its rest, and that is the custom of reading aloud, which occupied a place in Eleanor's household considerably larger than a modern listener might expect, filling the quiet hours between dinner and bed on evenings when no cards were laid out and no music seemed called for. Charles reads poorly, in the sense that his voice carries little natural drama, flat and steady regardless of whether the passage describes a quiet garden or a raging storm, and yet Eleanor has come, over the years, to genuinely enjoy these evenings regardless, settling into her usual chair with her needlework while he works steadily through whatever novel or collection of essays currently occupies the household's shared attention, his even, undramatic voice becoming over time less a performance to be judged, and more simply a familiar sound she associates with the particular safety of an ordinary evening at home. They are partway through a novel Mrs. Colby lent them some weeks ago, when a passage arrives that catches Eleanor's attention rather more sharply than most, a description of a woman's quiet, private disappointment that strikes her, hearing it read aloud in Charles's flat, unknowing voice, with an accuracy that feels almost uncomfortably close to something she has never said to him directly in 7 years of marriage. She says nothing, she simply sets a stitch, and then another, and lets the passage pass by the way it must, one sentence following another, Charles entirely unaware that anything in the room has shifted at all, and I think there is something worth noticing in this small, silent moment, a woman recognizing herself inside a stranger's fiction more completely than she has ever managed to recognize herself out loud, to the one person who shares her bed and her table, and the whole visible architecture of her days. It occurs to her later that night, lying awake during that familiar middle hour of broken sleep, the house entirely quiet around her, that this is perhaps the truest thing she could tell you if you were sitting beside her now, rather than simply listening from somewhere far off in your own dark room, that a whole life can be built, carefully, competently, even happily in its own fashion, from 1,000 small performances of composure, folded hands and lowered eyes, and precisely measured tea, and that underneath every one of those performances, in nearly every woman she has ever known well enough to glimpse it, there runs a second, private current entirely its own, sometimes as small as a passage in a borrowed novel that lands harder than it should, sometimes as large as a locked writing box and a column of figures that no one else has ever seen, and that neither version, the visible one or the hidden one, is somehow more real than the other. They are simply, both of them, the whole of her, held together, most nights, well enough to carry her safely through until morning. There is a particular kind of visitor Thorncombe receives, perhaps twice a year, that I have not yet told you about, and I think tonight is the night to do it, because the custom surrounding these visits reveals something about the strange, careful economy of hospitality that governed this world every bit as thoroughly as the economy of money did. These are what were known as extended country visits, distant relations or old family friends arriving not for an afternoon or an evening, but for a stay of a week, sometimes two, their trunks unloaded and carried up to the best guest bedroom with a formality that made clear to every servant in the house exactly how seriously this particular obligation was to be taken. This autumn brings such a visit from Charles's aunt, a formidable widow named Lady Sefton, no relation to the more famous patroness of the same name, who governed admission to London's most exclusive assembly rooms, though the coincidence of the name has caused Eleanor no small private amusement over the years. Lady Sefton arrives with her own lady's maid, her own particular habits, and an appetite for close, exacting observation of every detail of Thorncombe's management that leaves Eleanor feeling, for the better part of a week, rather like a schoolgirl being examined by a governess of unusually high standards. I want to tell you about the sheer logistical weight such a visit placed on a household like this one, because it is easy to imagine hospitality of this kind as simply an extension of ordinary daily life, when in fact it required a genuine reorganization of nearly every routine the house normally kept. Meals grew more elaborate, an additional course added to dinner each evening for the duration of the stay, since a guest of Lady Sefton's rank could not, under any circumstance, be served the same modest fare the family enjoyed when dining alone. The best linen, the pieces Eleanor keeps carefully set aside in the linen press for exactly this purpose, was brought out and pressed. A particular set of china, used perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, was washed and readied. Susan's own duties expanded considerably, assisting not only Eleanor but, at Lady Sefton's own maid's occasional request, helping to manage the older woman's more elaborate wardrobe as well, a small additional burden Susan bears without complaint, though Eleanor notices, by the 4th day of the visit, a particular tiredness settling into her maid's usually steady manner. Lady Sefton's conversation, when it is not devoted to close inspection of the household's management, turns frequently to family history, to Charles's late father, whom she remembers with a fondness that softens her otherwise exacting manner considerably, and Eleanor finds herself, over the course of the visit, genuinely warming to the old woman despite the exhausting demands of hosting her, discovering beneath the formidable exterior a sharp, dry wit that reminds Eleanor, more than once, of exactly the kind of observation she herself might commit to paper for Mr. Fenwick, if she ever dared write anything quite so close to home. By the time Lady Sefton's carriage finally departs down the long drive, the whole household exhales with a collective, unspoken relief that no one would ever admit to feeling aloud, and Eleanor spends the following 2 days simply restoring Thorncombe's ordinary rhythm. The good china returned to its cupboard, the extra course quietly dropped from the dinner table, the household settling back into the familiar, less exacting shape of its usual days, with the particular gratitude of a body that has been holding itself carefully upright for longer than it strictly wanted to. Let me tell you now about something small and strange that happens in the kitchen garden not long after Lady Sefton's departure, because it touches, gently, on a whole category of belief that ran alongside the more formal religious observance we discussed earlier in this story, a layer of folk custom that existed, without much apparent contradiction, right beside the household's genuine Sunday piety. Belle the gardener refuses, on a particular morning, to plant a new row of beans, despite the weather being entirely suitable and the ground well prepared, because the moon, according to a small worn almanac he keeps tucked in his coat pocket, is in what he calls the wrong quarter, a belief, common among gardeners of this era and for generations before it, that root vegetables should be planted during a waning moon, while anything grown for its fruit or seed above ground fared better planted during a waxing one. Eleanor, informed of this delay by Belle himself with the calm, unshakable confidence of a man reciting simple fact, does not argue with him, partly because she has learned, over years of observing his work, that Belle's garden consistently outperforms nearly every other kitchen garden in the neighborhood, moon phases or not, and partly because she has come to find a genuine, quiet comfort in the existence of rules and rhythms that have nothing whatsoever to do with rank, precedence, or the careful social architecture that governs nearly everything else in her days. This same almanac, consulted regularly by nearly every household on the estate, tenant and gentry alike, governs a surprising range of decisions beyond simple planting, advising on the most favorable days for cutting hair, for weaning a calf, for beginning any new undertaking a person hoped would prosper. Eleanor herself does not consult it directly, considering such things, in her more skeptical moments, closer to superstition than to genuine wisdom, and yet she notices, examining her own habits honestly, that she has absorbed a great deal of this same folk logic, without ever quite meaning to, avoiding, without conscious decision, the beginning of any important task on a Friday, a day widely held across the English countryside to be unlucky for new beginnings, a belief with roots reaching back, some say, to the crucifixion itself, though Eleanor could not, if pressed, explain precisely where she first absorbed the habit, or why it has never once occurred to her to question it. There is a particular charm, I think, in a world that held its formal, structured religion and its older, looser folk beliefs so comfortably alongside each other, rarely troubling to reconcile the two, or even to notice the tension between them. Reverend Whitfield himself, Eleanor's own father, entirely capable of delivering a rigorous, theologically careful sermon on a Sunday morning, while quietly observing, without any apparent sense of contradiction, that a bird flying into the church through an open window during a wedding was widely considered, throughout his parish, a sign of good fortune for the marriage about to be sealed within it. I want to tell you now about something that unfolds gradually, over the course of several weeks that winter, and which touches Eleanor's life more directly than almost anything else we have witnessed together tonight, and that is the arrival, at Thorncombe, of a new curate to assist the aging vicar who has served the parish for as long as anyone can remember, a young man named Mr. Hale, whose sermons, delivered for the first time on a cold Sunday in December, carry a warmth and a genuine intellectual seriousness that the parish has not experienced in some years. Eleanor finds herself, in the weeks that follow his arrival, listening to his sermons with an attention considerably sharper than her usual Sunday half-attentiveness, and I think it is worth being honest about why, because the reason is not, as a less careful telling of this story might suggest, any romantic interest, but something closer to genuine intellectual hunger, a recognition, sitting in her family pew, that here, finally, is a mind engaging with Scripture and with the wider world in a way that reminds her, powerfully, of the conversations she used to have with her own father before her marriage carried her away from that particular daily companionship. Mr. Hale, it emerges over the following months, maintains a small subscription to several of the same London periodicals Eleanor's father reads, including, as it happens, the very magazine that publishes Mr. Fenwick's essays, and Eleanor discovers this fact quite by accident during a parish meeting concerning repairs to the church roof, when Mr. Hale mentions in passing a recent essay he found particularly sharp and well observed, describing it in enough detail that Eleanor recognizes, with a small, private jolt that she is careful not to let show on her face, her own words being praised entirely sincerely by a man who has not the faintest idea he is speaking to their author. She says nothing, of course. She simply agrees mildly that the essay in question sounded rather clever and turns the conversation back toward the practical matter of the church roof. And yet she carries the moment with her for days afterward, turning it over privately with a satisfaction she does not entirely examine too closely, a confirmation, small but real, that Mr. Fenwick's voice reaches people, moves people, earns the genuine respect of a man whose own intellectual seriousness she has come to admire, all without that respect ever once being extended to Eleanor Ashworth herself, who must content herself, in every visible public sense, with being simply the mistress of Thorncombe, competent and composed and entirely unremarkable, in the eyes of everyone at the parish meeting who has just spent several minutes praising her own words back to her. I think there is something worth sitting with in this particular kind of quiet triumph, invisible to absolutely everyone but herself, and I think too that it says something rather lovely about Eleanor's character, that she carries it home that evening, not with bitterness, though she would have every right to a little bitterness if she wanted it, but with something closer to private, satisfied amusement, the particular pleasure of a woman who has built, patiently and entirely on her own, a second life substantial enough to earn genuine praise from a genuinely discerning reader, even if that praise can never once be claimed aloud. Let me tell you about bathing now, because it is one of those subjects that tends to produce genuine surprise when people first learn how differently it was approached in this period, and I think it deserves its own careful, unhurried explanation rather than the quick, half-embarrassed mention it usually receives. A full immersion bath, of the kind you likely take for granted in your own home, was at Thorncombe, and in most households of this era, a genuinely significant undertaking rather than a daily habit, requiring water heated over the kitchen fire in large quantities and carried up multiple flights of stairs by hand, filling a portable tin or copper tub set up temporarily in Eleanor's bedroom, a labour so considerable that a full bath happened, in her household, no more than once a week, sometimes less often through the coldest months of winter, when the sheer physical effort of heating and hauling enough water made the whole undertaking feel almost extravagant. This did not mean, and I want to be genuinely clear about this, that personal cleanliness was neglected in the intervals between these full baths. Eleanor washes at her basin every single morning without exception, a smaller, more manageable ritual using cool or lukewarm water and a cloth, attending carefully to her face, her hands, and, with particular thoroughness, to what the era's own etiquette writers referred to delicately as those parts of the body requiring the most frequent attention, a daily practice that kept a woman of Eleanor's careful habits considerably cleaner on any given ordinary day than the once weekly full bath alone might suggest to a modern listener imagining the whole picture. Hair, as I mentioned earlier in this story, was washed even less frequently than the body as a whole, a habit that strikes modern ears as alarming until you remember that Eleanor's hair spends most of every day pinned, curled and covered by a bonnet or cap, protected from the kind of daily exposure to dirt, sweat and open air that makes frequent modern hair washing genuinely necessary in a way it simply was not for a woman whose hair rarely left the careful architecture Susan builds around it each morning. I think what strikes me most, laying all of this out plainly, is how thoroughly a whole system of personal care could function, and function reasonably well by the standards of its own time, built around constraints, the labour of heating water, the expense of soap, the practical realities of managing long hair without modern conveniences, that a modern household simply does not have to consider at all. Eleanor was not, by any reasonable standard of her own era, an unclean woman. She was, rather, a woman whose relationship to cleanliness was shaped entirely by the physical and economic realities of the world she happened to be born into, exactly as yours is shaped, in ways you likely never think to examine, by the world you happen to have been born into instead. There is a whole world I have not yet properly described to you tonight, sitting just at the edge of everything we have witnessed at Thorncombe and in Fenbridge and in Bath, and that is the London season itself, the concentrated, intense stretch of spring and early summer when fashionable society abandoned the countryside almost entirely and gathered instead in the capital for a few frantic months of balls, presentations, and the serious, high-stakes business of finding husbands for the daughters of England's wealthiest families. Eleanor herself has never had a proper season, her family's modest clerical income never having stretched to cover the genuinely staggering expense such an undertaking required. A townhouse or suitable lodgings rented for months at a time, an entirely new wardrobe assembled specifically for London's more exacting fashionable standards, the fees required for a proper presentation, and Eleanor has always harboured, if she is honest with herself, a small private curiosity about that particular world she never got to inhabit, glimpsed only through the letters and second-hand accounts of wealthier acquaintances who did. Harriet's own family, similarly situated, never seriously considered a London season for her either, her eventual match with Captain Reeve arranged entirely through the more modest, local channels of neighbourhood acquaintance and careful chaperoned walks, rather than through the glittering, expensive machinery of a proper London debut, and I think it is worth being honest about what this meant for both women's prospects, since the season represented, for families who could afford it, an entirely different order of opportunity, a wider pool of eligible men, a considerably higher ceiling on the kind of match a young woman might realistically hope to make, all of it available only to families with the very particular combination of wealth and connection required to participate at all. Eleanor has heard enough over the years, through letters and through the second-hand gossip, that eventually filters down even to a village the size of Fenbridge, to have formed a reasonably clear picture of what she missed. The presentation at court itself, young women in elaborate white gowns and towering ostrich feathers, waiting for hours in a crowded antechamber for the brief, formal moment of being presented to royalty that officially marked their entrance into fashionable adult society, the exhausting nightly rounds of balls that might not conclude until nearly dawn, the careful, constant surveillance of Almack's, the most exclusive of London's assembly rooms, governed by a small handful of formidable patronesses whose approval, granted through a voucher nearly impossible to obtain without the right connections, determined whether a young woman could even enter the building at all. She does not, examining her own quieter, more modest life honestly, feel any great sense of loss about the season she never had. But she does, sometimes, on a particularly restless evening, allow herself to imagine it briefly, the noise, the crowds, the sheer concentrated intensity of a world moving so much faster than her own careful seasonal rhythm of tea, measured and linen counted and letters folded discreetly toward Bath, and she wonders, idly, what version of herself might have emerged from that faster, louder world, before deciding, most nights, that she is rather glad to have become instead the particular, quieter woman she actually is. Let me tell you about a small, strange custom now, that governed the relationship between visiting guests and the servants of any household they stayed in, because it produced in practice a whole quiet economy running alongside the more formal one Eleanor manages through her ledgers and locked keys. This was the custom of vails, small sums of money a departing guest was expected to distribute among the servants of the household they had been visiting, a footman who had carried their trunks, a housemaid who had tended their fire, a practice so thoroughly expected that its absence, a guest departing without leaving anything at all for the staff, was noted and remembered, quietly but unmistakably, long after the guests themselves had gone. This custom created its own particular tensions that Eleanor has witnessed more than once over the years, since a poorer guest, invited perhaps out of genuine affection or family obligation, rather than any expectation of matched wealth, might find the accumulated cost of vails across a lengthy country visit, this footman, that housemaid, the coachman who drove them to the local posting inn, adding up to a genuinely uncomfortable sum, one that some etiquette writers of the period actually complained about at length, arguing that the custom had grown burdensome enough to discourage exactly the kind of warm, informal hospitality between friends of unequal means that a more generous age might otherwise have encouraged. Lady Sefton, during her recent visit, distributed her veils with a precision that impressed even Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who mentioned it to Eleanor afterward, with the particular approving tone she reserves for guests who understand exactly how such things ought to be managed. A coin for each servant calibrated exactly to their rank and to the particular service they had rendered during her stay, Susan receiving rather more than the ordinary housemaids in recognition of the additional duties she had taken on assisting Lady Sefton's own maid throughout the visit. I mention all of this because I think it illustrates, once again, how thoroughly money and rank and obligation wove themselves into even the smallest, most apparently personal interactions of this world. A guest's departure from a country house never quite as simple as a warm farewell and a promise to write, but instead a small, final performance of precisely calibrated generosity, watched and remembered by an entire household of servants whose own daily comfort depended, in some real measure, on visitors' understanding and honouring an obligation that existed nowhere in writing, and yet was understood, universally, as binding all the same. Twelfth Night arrives not long after this, marking the formal close of the Christmas season, and Thorncombe observes it with a modest gathering of neighbouring families, a cake baked with a single dried bean hidden somewhere within it, the finder crowned, for the remainder of the evening, king or queen of the festivities, a small piece of playful, temporary misrule that Eleanor has always rather enjoyed, watching, this particular year, as the bean turns up in a slice served to the youngest footman rather than to any member of the gentry present, and the whole household, gentry and servants briefly mingled for this one licensed evening of reversed hierarchy, spends a cheerful hour deferring with real and genuine good humour to a young man who spends every other night of the year several careful steps below them in the household's ordinary unbending order. There is one more thread I want to gather up before we finally let this whole long year settle toward its close, and it concerns Harriet, now some months into her own marriage and settled with Captain Reeve in a modest but comfortable house not far from his family's own estate, close enough that she and Eleanor have kept up a steady, warm correspondence since the wedding, letters that arrive at Thorncombe perhaps twice a month, and which Eleanor has come to genuinely treasure. Harriet's letters carry, over these first months of marriage, a particular arc that Eleanor recognizes with real quiet tenderness, the early ones bright and breathless, full of small domestic triumphs and the sheer novelty of running a household of her own, gradually giving way, by the fourth or fifth month, to something more measured, more honest, small confessions of tiredness, of the particular loneliness that can settle into even a genuinely happy marriage once the initial excitement has worn into ordinary daily rhythm, of a disagreement with Captain Reeve over some household matter that Harriet describes with a carefulness that tells Eleanor, reading between the lines with the practiced eye of a woman 7 years further along this same road, that the disagreement mattered rather more than Harriet's own careful phrasing lets on. Eleanor answers these letters with real thought, offering the kind of practical, hard-won guidance that no etiquette manual or well-meaning mother could quite replicate, advice about managing a household's accounts, about the particular art of disagreeing with a husband in a way that resolves the actual problem without wounding either party's pride, about the slow, patient work of building a marriage's own private rhythm, different from every other marriage, including Eleanor's own, and requiring, always, a certain amount of quiet trial and error that no amount of advanced preparation could ever fully substitute for. She does not tell Harriet about Mr. Fenwick, not yet, though she catches herself, more than once, drafting sentences in her mind that edge close to the confession, wondering whether Harriet, still young enough to be genuinely surprised by the world, rather than settled into its familiar shape the way Eleanor herself has become, might understand the secret better than anyone else in her life, might even, someday, want a version of it for herself. She sets the thought aside each time, unfinished, the way she has learned to set aside so many thoughts that do not yet have a clear place to land, trusting, with the same patient confidence she brings to nearly everything else in her carefully managed life, that the right moment for that particular honesty will arrive eventually on its own schedule, the way most true things in her experience eventually do. Let me tell you about one more small object before we close. A single piece of furniture that sits in the corner of Eleanor's bedroom and which I have mentioned only in passing so far tonight, though it deserves a fuller telling because it anchors, more completely than almost anything else in this house, the particular, quiet rhythm of how Eleanor actually experiences the private hours of her own day. It is a small writing desk, distinct from the larger writing box with its false bottom and its locked column of figures, a modest piece of furniture with a sloped lid that lifts to reveal a shallow interior fitted with small compartments for pens, ink, sealing wax and paper, entirely ordinary, entirely visible, sitting in plain sight where any visitor to her bedroom might notice it without a second thought. This is where Eleanor conducts the whole of her ordinary, unremarkable correspondence. Letters to Harriet, letters to her father, the household's more formal written business, and I think there is something worth noticing in how her genuine secret lives, not in some elaborate theatrical hiding place, but tucked instead behind the false bottom of a perfectly ordinary object, sitting right beside this entirely visible one, hidden less through any particular cleverness of construction, and more through the simple, reliable fact that no one in her household has ever once thought to look. The ink she uses is mixed by her own hand, following a recipe in her still room book, oak gall and iron sulfate, and a little gum arabic, boiled and strained with the same careful attention she brings to her preserves and her medicinal syrups, since purchasing ink ready-made, while certainly possible, represented an expense that a household managed with real economy preferred to avoid wherever a woman's own competent labour could substitute for it instead. She has, over the years, developed a genuine, quiet expertise in the mixing of it, knowing precisely how long to boil the mixture, precisely how much gum to add for the particular thickness she prefers for her finer, more careful writing, a small domestic skill that exists, like so much else in her life, almost entirely unremarked upon by anyone who benefits from it. Sealing a letter, too, carries its own small ritual worth describing. The wax melted over a candle flame and dripped onto the folded paper, then pressed, while still soft, with a small brass seal bearing the Ashworth family crest, a design Eleanor has used so many hundreds of times over the years that she could press it correctly with her eyes closed. The particular weight and angle of the seal against the cooling wax, a motion her hand has long since committed entirely to memory, requiring no more conscious thought than the folding of her hands during a garden walk or the lowering of her eyes during family prayer. It is at this same small ordinary desk, working by candlelight on an evening not so different from any other, that Eleanor eventually decides, after months of turning the question over privately, exactly what she intends to do with the growing sum locked away in her hidden ledger. And I think this decision, when it finally arrives, deserves to be the last piece of her story I share with you tonight. She decides, in the end, on something that surprises even her a little, sitting with the thought fully formed for the first time, and finding it fits her better than any of the other possibilities she has turned over across the many months since that first bank draft arrived from London. She will not spend it on herself, not primarily, and she will not simply let it sit, growing, for its own sake, as she once imagined she might. Instead, she resolves to set it aside, quietly, steadily, as a private fund intended for Harriet's own daughters, should Harriet have them, or for any young woman in her wider circle who might, some day, find herself in genuine need of the kind of quiet, independent resource that neither the law nor the ordinary architecture of a woman's inheritance reliably provided. A dowry supplement, perhaps, or simply a private cushion against the particular vulnerability of a woman whose entire financial existence depended, as Mrs. Colby's so nearly had, on the character and continued goodwill of whichever man happened to hold legal authority over her life. There is something quietly radical in this decision, though Eleanor herself would likely resist the word if you offered it to her directly. And I do not think she experiences the choice as any kind of grand gesture. It is, in her own mind, simply the most sensible use for money that arrived, in the first place, through her own quiet defiance of the very rules that would otherwise have prevented her from earning it at all. A small, patient act of building, for other women she may never even meet, exactly the kind of private safety net she has spent these past years so carefully constructing for herself. She writes none of this down anywhere Charles might find it, of course. The ledger remains locked, the column of figures continues its quiet, steady growth, and Mr. Fenwick continues, twice a week, in the small back room off the rear of the house, to observe the world with the same sharp, quietly amused attention that has carried Eleanor through 7 years of folded hands and lowered eyes and precisely measured tea, and will, she suspects, carry her through a good many more years yet to come, this second, private self existing alongside the first exactly as it always has, unseen by nearly everyone, and entirely, steadily, her own. Autumn has come round again at Thorncombe by the time this particular decision finally settles into place, the same vinegar smell on cold window glass, the same first fires being lit against the coming chill, the same small, careful rhythms that opened this whole long story so many months ago now, closing back around themselves, the way a year always eventually does, one season folding quietly into the next, each one carrying forward everything the last one built, without ever quite announcing the transition at all. I want to leave you, before we finally close, with one last small scene, because I think it captures something true about the particular texture of an ordinary evening at Thorncombe better than any single explanation could manage on its own. It is a Tuesday, unremarkable in every visible way, and the household has settled into its familiar late-hour rhythm, Charles already retired, the last of the fires banked low, Susan long since dismissed for the night after finishing with Eleanor's hair. Eleanor sits, as she so often does, at her small ordinary writing desk, though tonight she is not working on anything for Mr. Fenwick, simply finishing a letter to Harriet, her pen moving steadily across the page in the particular, well-practiced hand she has used for this exact purpose thousands of times over the years. Outside, past the drawn curtains, The first real cold of the season has settled over the garden, and somewhere beyond that, past the low stone wall and the lane and the dark shape of the mill, the whole of Hampshire lies quiet under a sky Eleanor cannot see but knows, from long familiarity with this particular hour, is almost certainly full of stars, the kind of deep, uninterrupted darkness that a house lit only by candlelight and firelight makes so much more vivid than anything a modern town, glowing at every hour with electric light, could ever quite offer its own restless sleepers. She finishes the letter, seals it with the familiar weight and angle of the Ashworth crest pressed into cooling wax, and sets it aside for the morning post. Then, because it is that particular hour when the house has gone fully quiet and no one remains awake to require anything further of her, she allows herself a few minutes of simply sitting, hands still for once, folded loosely in her lap rather than occupied with any task at all, the candle burning low and steady in front of her, throwing soft, moving shadows across the familiar shapes of her room, the bed, the mirror, the small locked writing box waiting patiently in its usual place. I think there is something worth treasuring in this particular kind of stillness, so rare in a life built as thoroughly around visible occupation as Eleanor's has been, and I think, if you have made it this far into tonight's long story, you might understand exactly why she values it the way she does, this small private pocket of time belonging to absolutely no one but herself, requiring nothing, performing nothing, simply existing, quietly, in the candlelight, for as long as it lasts before sleep finally, gently claims her. It does not last very long, this particular evening. A few minutes only, the candle burning perhaps another half-inch lower before Eleanor finally rises, snuffs it carefully rather than blowing it out, and crosses the dark room to her bed, where Charles's steady breathing has already settled into the familiar rhythm of genuine sleep. She lies down beside him, pulls the blankets up against the season's first real cold, and closes her eyes, and I think, wherever you are right now, however long you have been listening, this is probably a rather good moment for you to do exactly the same thing. I want to add one final small observation before I let this story close properly, because it has been sitting with me the whole time I have been telling you about Eleanor, and I think it deserves to be said plainly rather than simply implied underneath everything else. What strikes me most about this whole long year at Thorncombe, turning it over now at the very end, is not any single dramatic event, because there were, if you noticed, remarkably few of those. No great scandal befell this household, no fortune was lost or won. Eleanor's life, examined from a sufficient distance, looks almost entirely uneventful, a woman measuring tea, visiting tenants, dressing for dinners that followed the same careful choreography they always followed, writing letters that travelled the same familiar roads to Bath and back, and yet I do not think uneventful is quite the right word for what we have actually witnessed together tonight, because underneath that calm, repeating surface, an entire private world was running the whole time, patient, persistent, almost entirely invisible to everyone around her, a second self built slowly, sentence by sentence, twice a week, in a small back room most of her own household has probably never once thought to wonder about. I think that is true of a great many ordinary-seeming lives, if you look closely enough, this quiet, steady work of building something private and entirely your own, underneath whatever visible shape your days happen to take, and I think there is something worth carrying with you into your own rest tonight, the reminder that stillness on the surface rarely means stillness underneath it, and that a life can look, from the outside, like nothing much is happening at all, while carrying, quietly, the whole weight of something genuinely remarkable. And so we leave her there, in that particular ordinary darkness that has closed over Thorncombe every single night of this whole long story, no different, in the end, from the darkness closing over your own room right now, wherever that room happens to be tonight, whatever small private world you happen to be carrying quietly underneath your own visible days. I think too that this is perhaps the quiet gift a story like this one can offer, so many months after it began, back on that October morning with the vinegar and the cold window glass and the small ordinary chewing of an unused jaw in front of a mirror. Not a lesson exactly, and certainly not a moral, but simply the company of another life, distant in time and circumstance, and yet recognizable, somehow, in its patient private texture, close enough that you might carry a small piece of it with you now into your own rest. Perhaps, somewhere in your own life, there is a version of that same locked writing box, a small private column of figures or thoughts or hopes that belongs entirely to you and to no one else, tended quietly, patiently, in whatever spare hour the rest of your days happen to leave available. If there is, I hope tonight has offered it a little gentle company, and if there is not, I hope it has offered you at the very least a slow and pleasant hour drifting through a world considerably quieter and considerably slower than your own, on your way, at last, into the kind of deep, unhurried sleep that Eleanor herself has already, some time ago now, found. Rest well, and thank you genuinely for spending this particular stretch of your evening here, in the quiet, careful company of a woman and a house that existed, in their own small way, a very long time ago, and yet somehow, tonight, still feel close enough to touch. Sleep now, slowly, gently, the whole of the night still ahead of you, exactly as it should be. Good night, wherever you are tonight, whoever you are, and thank you again for staying with this story all the way through to its quiet, gentle end. Rest easy now. Good night, truly, and sleep well tonight. That, I think, is the real shape of Eleanor Ashworth's world, and perhaps in its own way, the real shape of a great many women's worlds in this particular corner of history, worlds built from rules so specific and so total that the smallest gestures, a folded corner of card, a colour of dress, a sprig of dried myrtle pressed between the pages of a book, carried entire conversations that never needed to be spoken aloud at all. It was, in so many ways, a world of tremendous constraint. And yet, somehow, inside that constraint, women like Eleanor still found their own small rooms, their own locked boxes, their own quiet columns of figures that belonged to no one but themselves. The house at Thorncombe sleeps now, has been sleeping for some hours, the fires banked low, the candles long since out, Susan asleep in her own small room above the kitchen, Belle's seedlings resting undisturbed in the cold frame at the edge of the garden, the mill-wheel still and silent by the dark water. Somewhere in the middle of the house, in a bedroom with the curtains drawn, Eleanor has drifted, at last, into that first deep stretch of sleep, the writing box closed and locked beside her, its small private column of figures resting, for now, exactly where she left it, waiting, patient as everything else in this slow, careful world, for morning to come round again. And I think that is a good place to leave her, and a good place to leave you too, if you have not drifted off already somewhere along the way tonight. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day brought you here, I hope this hour has done for you exactly what it did for Eleanor at the end of hers, a slow, quiet settling, nothing more required of you now, nothing left to manage or arrange or hold together, just the dark and your own unhurried thoughts, and the patient, certain knowledge that morning will come round again, the same as it always does. Sleep well, truly.